She has one rule: never be seen. In a world where alphas claim their mates at the great mating ceremony, Sera has spent years making herself invisible. Gray dresses, downcast eyes, forgettable. Because the moment an alpha looks at her, really looks at her, she dies. That's not a metaphor. The oracle said it herself the night Sera turned 16. The bond that finds you will be the bond that kills you. So when her pack is summoned to the royal mating ceremony, the one night every eligible wolf in the kingdom must attend, Sera does the only thing she can. She goes in disguise. A stolen mask, a borrowed gown. One night, invisible in a crowd of thousands. Except the Alpha King finds her anyway. And now, 3 days later, the most powerful man in the kingdom is hunting the masked woman who ran from him at midnight, using her as his lead investigator. He doesn't know her name. He doesn't know her face. He has no idea she's standing right in front of him. And Sera has never been more terrified in her life, because for the first time since that prophecy, she doesn't want to run. Chapter 1. The trick to being invisible was never about the clothes. Sera had learned that at age 9, watching her older sister Lyra command an entire dining hall just by walking into it. Chin lifted, shoulders back, amber eyes catching the light like two small fires. Lyra didn't try to be seen. She simply was, the way a thunderstorm simply is, and every head in the room turned whether it wanted to or not. Sera had stood in the doorway that evening, in a dress their mother had sewn from the same bolt of fabric as Lyra's, and not a single person had looked up. She'd gone back to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and thought about it for a long time. Then she'd decided, good. Invisible was safe. Invisible was survival. And after the oracle's words 7 years later, delivered in that dry, bored voice, as though cursing a teenage girl to a life of solitude was just another item on the afternoon's agenda, invisible became the only thing Sera knew how to be. The bond that finds you will be the bond that kills you. The first alpha who sees you, truly sees you, will trigger a mate bond so powerful it will burn you alive from the inside out. Not a metaphor, child. Sit down. Sera had sat down. She had been sitting down, metaphorically speaking, ever since. The village of Crestmore sat at the far western edge of the Ironvale Kingdom, which meant it was the last place the royal summons reached, and the first place everyone assumed didn't matter. Sera had always loved that about it. Irrelevance had a particular texture here, wood smoke and pine resin and the distant sound of the river, and she'd spent the last 8 years wrapping herself in it like a second skin. She worked as a record keeper for the pack's elder council. Numbers, ledgers, census rolls, land agreements. Work that kept her behind a desk, in a back room, with her hair pinned up and her eyes down, and absolutely zero reason for any alpha to spare her a second glance. It was a good life. It was a careful life. And then the royal scroll arrived on a Tuesday, which Sera had always considered a deeply untrustworthy day of the week. Every eligible wolf in Crestmore between the ages of 18 and 30 is hereby commanded to attend the great mating ceremony at the royal capital on the night of the blood moon. Attendance is not optional. Absence without documented medical exception will be considered an act of defiance against the crown and punishable by Pack Elder Doran. I have a documented medical exception, Sera said, before the man had even finished reading. Doran lowered the scroll and looked at her over the tops of his spectacles. He was 73 years old, approximately the size of a wardrobe, and had the patient expression of a man who had heard every possible excuse from every possible person across 5 decades of pack leadership. You're not ill, Sera. I have a condition. You have an aversion to inconvenience. I have a prophecy, she said, keeping her voice very level, because she'd learned that levelness was more persuasive than desperation. Documented. On file. In the 3rd cabinet from the left, under O for Oracle, which I filed myself 2 years ago specifically for situations like this. Doran set the scroll down on his desk and folded his hands. The royal summons supersedes all prior documentation, including Oracle records, in matters of ceremonial attendance. That's been kingdom law for 60 years. He paused. I'm sorry, child. I truly am. But if you don't attend, they'll send soldiers. Sera stood very still for a moment. Outside the window, 2 children were chasing each other through the square, shrieking with laughter. A cart horse stood at the trough, patient and unbothered. The sky was the flat gray of early autumn, comfortable and featureless. She thought about soldiers coming to Crestmore because of her. She thought about what that would cost the pack. "Fine," she said. "But I'll need 3 days to prepare." Doran nodded, already reaching for the next piece of correspondence. "That's all the time we have anyway." Sera walked out of his office and immediately began planning the one thing she was absolutely, unequivocally not supposed to do. The disguise took 2 days to assemble. The gown she borrowed from her cousin Mira, who was roughly her height and had a weakness for dramatic fashion. A deep emerald silk that Sera would never have chosen for herself, which was exactly the point. The mask came from a traveling merchant who set up near the East Gate every autumn and sold, among other things, elaborate solstice costumes. It was a beautiful thing, ivory and gold, covering everything above the lip, with a spray of tiny white feathers along the left temple. She stood in front of the small mirror in her bedroom and looked at herself for a long time. She didn't look like Sera. Sera wore gray. Sera wore her hair flat against her skull. Sera had learned to make her posture apologetic, shoulders slightly rounded, gaze slightly lowered, a physical vocabulary that said nothing to see here in every language simultaneously. The woman in the mirror wore emerald and gold and stood differently, somehow, taller. Not because of the heeled shoes, though those helped. Something in the architecture of the disguise itself seemed to require a different spine. "This is a terrible idea," she told her reflection. Her reflection did not disagree. "In and out," she continued. "You attend. You are seen by the record keepers. Your name goes on the list. You do not make eye contact with any alpha above the rank of elder. You stay near the edges. You leave by the 3rd bell." She practiced walking in the heeled shoes for an hour. Then she packed everything into a small travel case, laid down on her bed without changing out of her gray day dress, and did not sleep. The royal capital was called Valdenmere, and it was precisely the kind of city that made Sera's teeth ache. Everything was big. The gates were big. The streets were wide and cobbled and flanked by buildings that seemed to be in competition with each other for height. The people moved differently here, purposeful and fast, as though time in Valdenmere was a scarcer resource than elsewhere, as though standing still was a mild form of civic failure. The Crestmore delegation arrived mid-afternoon and were assigned to lodgings in the western quarter, a cluster of clean, modest rooms above a bakery, which Sera appreciated because the smell of bread was calming. She claimed the room at the end of the hallway, the one with the window that faced a blank stone wall rather than the street, unpacked precisely nothing, and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap. In 4 hours, the ceremony would begin. She ran through the plan again. In and out. Name on the list. Edges of the room. Gone by the 3rd bell. Simple. Completely straightforward. Absolutely nothing to worry about. The Great Hall of Valdenmere Palace was not a room. It was a declaration. Sera stood just inside the entrance and felt the scale of it land on her chest like something physical. Vaulted ceilings lost in shadow. Walls hung with tapestries in deep crimson and gold. 1,000 candles burning in iron chandeliers that swayed almost imperceptibly in the warm air rising from the crowd below. The floor was pale marble, polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the candlelight in long amber smears. And the people, hundreds of them, maybe 1,000. Every eligible wolf in the kingdom, summoned to one place, dressed in their finest, moving in slow eddies of silk and sound and barely contained nervous energy. Sera exhaled very slowly. She had the mask on. She had the emerald gown. She had her hair loose, which she almost never did. It fell to the middle of her back, darker than it looked in her usual flat style, catching the candlelight in a way that made her feel conspicuous and glamorous and deeply uncomfortably unlike herself. She did not like it. She headed for the edges. The outer perimeter of the hall was lined with columns, and behind the columns were alcoves, shallow recesses just deep enough for one person to stand in and watch the proceedings without being watched in return. Sera found one near the far left wall and stationed herself there with a glass of something sparkling that she did not drink, arranged to look like a person who was simply taking a moment, rather than a person who was hiding in an architectural feature. She was good at this. 8 years of practice. The ceremony began at the first bell. An elder in formal robes spoke about the sacred nature of the mate bond, about the blessing of the blood moon, about the long tradition of the great ceremony going back 400 years to the founding of the Iron Veil Kingdom. Sera noted that he used the word sacred 7 times in 4 minutes, which seemed like 3 times too many. She watched the crowd. She did not look at the raised dais at the far end of the hall, where the Alpha King sat. She was making a very specific point of not looking at the dais. She had, in fact, arranged her position behind a column specifically to reduce her sight line to the dais to approximately 0. Everything was going according to plan. And then someone stepped on her foot. "Oh, stars, I'm sorry." The voice was low and genuinely startled, and the person attached to it caught her arm before she could stumble backward into the column. The sparkling drink sloshed. Sera grabbed the glass with her free hand, managed to save approximately 70% of it, and looked up. It was not an alpha. It was a young man, perhaps 25, with a round, pleasant face, light brown skin, and the most genuinely apologetic expression she had ever seen on a human being. He was wearing formal clothes that sat on him, the way formal clothes sit on people who wear formal clothes, approximately once a year. "I'm so sorry," he said again. "I was trying to avoid that woman in the blue dress. She's been trying to introduce me to her daughter for 45 minutes, and I didn't see you because of the column, and your foot was just... Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Sera said. "My drink is mostly fine. I can get you another one." He looked around. "I think. I don't actually know where they're getting them from." He paused. "I'm Enki. I'm from the Dusk Hollow Pack. I'm a healer's assistant, which means I'm not technically eligible for the ceremony, but I came anyway because my Alpha Elder said it would be, and I quote, character building." Sera looked at him for a moment. "Sera," she said. "Crestmore Pack, record keeper. Also not particularly here by choice? Legally compelled." He nodded seriously. "We should probably stand together then. Safety in numbers. Or at least safety in having someone to talk to while we wait for the whole thing to be over." He glanced toward the dais for the first time, and something in his expression shifted. A kind of reflexive awareness, the way everyone in the room seemed to angle themselves slightly toward the front without quite realizing it. "Have you seen him yet?" Sera kept her eyes on her drink. "I haven't been looking. He arrived about 20 minutes ago. The Alpha King." Enki's voice dropped slightly, not from reverence, but from the habit of someone accustomed to hospitals and quiet rooms. You'd know it if you'd seen him. He has that thing." "What thing?" "The thing where the room gets heavier when he walks in." Sera said nothing. "They say he's never felt a mate pull in 12 years of ruling," Enki continued, with the casual tone of someone relaying very interesting gossip. "Not once, not at any of the regional ceremonies. There are all sorts of theories. His wolf is dormant. He's already secretly mated. He's cursed." A small pause. "Or he just hasn't met her yet." Said Sera, because it was the shortest possible acknowledgement. She was going to leave at the 3rd bell. The 3rd bell was 2 hours away. She could do this. She almost made it. She was 40 minutes from the 3rd bell, still stationed in her alcove, successfully invisible, when the crowd shifted, just slightly. A subtle redistribution of bodies, the way water moves when something large disturbs it from beneath. She looked up before she could stop herself. He was crossing the hall. The Alpha King, Calum, she knew his name from the kingdom records she maintained. King Calum Dravane, 29th of his line, 34 years old, ascended at 22, was walking through the crowd, and Enki had been right. The room got heavier. He was taller than she'd expected from the formal portraits, which somehow always flattened powerful people into 2 dimensions. Dark hair, dark eyes. She couldn't tell the exact shade from here, the kind of face that looked like it had been designed by someone making a very deliberate point. He wore black with a single thread of gold at the collar. No crown, no ceremony, and he moved through the crowd the way water moves downhill, not forcing anything, simply finding the most direct path by the nature of what he was. People stepped aside. They didn't seem to decide to do it. They just did. Sera pressed herself back against the alcove wall. He was moving toward the left side of the hall, toward the columns, toward her. She calculated. The alcove was deep enough to keep her shadowed if she stayed still. He would pass the column, continue along the wall, and move toward the group of pack elders gathered near the far door. This was fine. This was manageable. She simply needed to stand completely still and keep her gaze down and not. His eyes moved across the alcove. Stopped. For one fraction of a second, across 30 feet of candlelit space, through the crowd and the noise and the smoke from 1,000 burning candles. He looked directly at her. Not at the crowd near her. Not at the column. Not at the general vicinity. At her. With a kind of arrested attention that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and felt significantly longer. Then someone spoke to him, a general, from the look of the uniform, and his gaze pulled away, and he turned, and the moment was over. Sera stood in her alcove and did not breathe for what she estimated was approximately 15 seconds. Then she put her unfinished drink on the narrow ledge beside her, straightened her spine, and walked, calmly, unhurriedly, in the manner of someone with absolutely nowhere important to be, toward the nearest exit. She found Enki on the way out and touched his arm. "I'm leaving." He turned from the conversation he'd been half having with a woman to his left and blinked at her. "Now? The bell hasn't—" "I know." She squeezed his arm once. "It was nice to meet you." She was through the side door before he could answer. Outside, the night air was cold and clean and smelled like autumn, and Sera walked quickly through the torchlit courtyard and told herself that it was fine. The eye contact had been nothing. 2 seconds in a crowd of hundreds. He hadn't seen her, not in the way the oracle meant, not in the way that mattered. She was fine. She would go back to the lodgings, change out of the gown, pack the mask away, and in the morning she would board the cart back to Crestmore and file this entire evening underattended as required, and never think about it again. She was fine. She was absolutely, completely, 100%. She walked directly into someone. She bounced backward. A hand caught her elbow. Swift, automatic, the reflexes of someone very accustomed to catching things, and she looked up. The Alpha King looked down at her. This close, his eyes were dark amber. She hadn't been able to tell from across the room. Dark amber, and currently fixed on her face, with an expression that was somewhere between surprised and something else she didn't have a word for immediately. "Careful," he said. His voice was low and even, not unkind. The world went completely quiet. Not actually quiet. The distant noise of the ceremony continued through the walls, music starting now, the low hum of 100 conversations. But inside Sera's skull, everything went very still, the way it goes still in the second before lightning, when the air itself seems to pause and reconsider. "No," she thought, with terrible clarity. "No, no, no." "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice came out steady, which was the most impressive thing she had ever done. "I wasn't watching where I was walking." She pulled her elbow free, gently, not abruptly, took one step back and turned. "Wait." She walked. Not running. Running attracted attention and memory. She walked, quickly, around the corner of the colonnade and into the shadow of the courtyard wall, and then she did run. Quiet, controlled, the run of someone who had rehearsed departures, through the side gate and into the street beyond. She didn't stop until she was 3 blocks away. She stood under a lamppost and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and breathed. "It was nothing," she told herself. "He caught your arm for 2 seconds. He said 4 words. That is not the bond. That is not what the oracle described. You are fine." Her wolf, who had been silent and dormant for so long that Sera sometimes forgot she was there, turned over slowly in the back of her mind. Like something waking up. No, Sera thought, sharp and clear, directly at her. Her wolf went still. But she didn't go back to sleep. Sera lay in her room above the bakery and stared at the ceiling and listened to the city settle into night. And she made herself a promise that was also a rule, that was also the only thing standing between her and the kind of ending the oracle had described. She would go home. She would be gray again. She would be forgettable again. She would never put on that mask again. She would never think about dark amber eyes again. Whatever had happened in that courtyard, the silence, the stillness, the thing her wolf had done, it was an anomaly, a moment. It would pass, the way all moments passed, and she would go back to being the person she was very good at being, careful, controlled, and invisible. It was the only choice she had. She closed her eyes. In the dark behind them, something that felt dangerously like longing curled up quietly and refused to leave. Chapter 2. Calum Dravain had ruled the Ironvale Kingdom for 12 years, and in those 12 years he had developed exactly 3 personal rules. The first, never make a promise you can't keep with force if necessary. The second, always read the original document, never the summary. The third, and this one he had arrived at slowly, through experience rather than principle, never trust a feeling you can't explain. He was currently violating the third rule in a significant way, and it was making him irritable. The morning after the great mating ceremony, Calum sat at the long table in his private council chamber and listened to his general Riven deliver the attendance summary with the efficient cheerlessness that made him excellent at his job. 412 eligible wolves attended from the Eastern Territories, 307 from the Western. The Northern pack sent slightly fewer than projected. There's a border dispute with the Halvanmere clan that's keeping several pack elders occupied. Southern attendance was the highest on record. Riven set down the scroll. No confirmed bonds formed among the nobility. 2 among the common attendees, still being verified. Overall, the ceremony is being assessed as the Western packs, Calum said. Riven paused. Your Majesty? Which packs attended from the West, specifically? He kept his voice level, the way he kept most things, level being a conscious choice rather than a natural state at this point. Give me the list. Riven looked at him for a moment, with the particular expression of a man who had served the king for 9 years, and had learned to ask exactly 0 follow-up questions when that tone appeared. He reached for a secondary scroll. Dusk Hollow, Ferngate, Crestmore, Ashbell, Wolver's Ridge, Ironside, Crestmore. Another pause. Yes, Your Majesty. Small pack. Far west. They sent 14 eligible wolves. He consulted the scroll. 13 women, 1 man. The man is a healer's assistant, apparently. Technically ineligible but attended regardless. His pack elder approved the exception. Calum said nothing for a moment. Do you have the names? Riven's expression did something complicated and controlled. I can have the full registry pulled from the ceremony records. It will take until this afternoon. This morning. Yes, Your Majesty. After Riven left, Calum sat alone in the council chamber for a few minutes and looked at the far wall and thought about the third rule and how it existed for a reason and how he was currently ignoring it with both hands. He could not explain what had happened last night. That was the problem. He had been at 7 great mating ceremonies. As a young man before his ascension, twice as a reluctant attendee, 5 times as king, fulfilling the ceremonial requirement of the crown's presence. In all 7, across all the eligible wolves the kingdom had assembled, he had felt nothing. Not absence. He was accustomed to absence. His wolf had been quiet on the subject of mates for so long that Calum had privately concluded the bond simply wasn't available to him, for whatever reason. Something structural, something about power at a certain level creating its own kind of isolation. He'd made peace with it, mostly. Last night he had been crossing the hall, avoiding a prolonged conversation with 3 pack elders who wanted to discuss the northern border dispute in the middle of a ceremony, which was not the time, and something had pulled his attention to the left. Not a sound, not a movement. Something quieter and more insistent than either of those things, like a compass needle finding north. There had been a woman in one of the alcoves along the left wall. He'd seen her for perhaps 2 seconds before Riven appeared at his shoulder with the general's report. A mask, ivory and gold. An emerald gown, dark hair loose, standing very still in the shadow of the column with a glass she wasn't drinking from, watching the room with the careful, peripheral attention of someone who had spent a lot of time watching rooms without being watched in return. He knew that kind of watching. He did it himself. His wolf, who had been silent on the subject of mates for 12 years, had done something. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the stories, the thunderclap recognition, the sudden overwhelming pull. It was quieter than that, and somehow more alarming because of the quiet. A slow, heavy certainty. like a key turning in a lock that he hadn't known was there. There, his wolf had said, and nothing else. And then she'd been gone. He had followed her, not immediately, and not for that reason, or not only for that reason. He told himself it was because she'd left before the ceremony's formal close, which was technically a violation of the summons, and found her in the courtyard, walking quickly toward the gate with the focused energy of someone executing a plan. He had caught her arm when she walked into him, and she'd looked up at him, and he'd seen her eyes through the bottom half of the mask, dark, wide, and for one unguarded second, utterly terrified. And then she'd pulled away and walked, and he'd said wait, and she hadn't. No one didn't wait when the Alpha King said wait. He had stood in the courtyard and watched her go around the corner and thought, she knew who I was. That was interesting. More than interesting. The ceremony records arrived at the 10th hour of the morning, delivered by a junior archivist who set the leather folder on the table with the reverence of someone delivering a sacred object, and then retreated quickly. Talem opened the folder. 14 names from Crestmore Pack. 1 male, Enki Barrow, healer's assistant, 24 years old, Dusk Hollow affiliated, attending under elder exception. 13 women, listed with their roles in the pack. Mira Calloway, seamstress's apprentice, 23. Brea Hollins, merchant's daughter, 22. Davin Ostler, fishmonger's daughter, 26. He went through them methodically. Sera Voss, record keeper, 24. He stopped. Read it again. Sera Voss, record keeper, Crestmore Pack, 24 years old. He turned the page, looking for the physical descriptors that ceremony record keepers were required to note. Height, hair color, any identifying features, for census purposes. Height, average. Hair, dark brown, worn loose for the ceremony, notable. Attendee typically wears hair pinned. Eyes, dark, no distinguishing marks on file. Worn loose for the ceremony, typically worn pinned. Calum set the folder down on the table. He sat back. He was a methodical man. He had built 12 years of stable rule on the architecture of method, on not leaping, on not assuming, on following evidence to conclusions rather than conclusions backward to evidence. Every advisor he'd ever had told him it was his greatest strength and his most frustrating quality simultaneously. He looked at the ceiling. Then he picked up the folder, carried it to the door, and opened it. His head of household staff, a compact, efficient woman named Barda, looked up from her post in the corridor. I need a messenger to Crestmore Pack, he said. I need a formal request drawn up. I'm establishing a task force to identify an attendee who left the ceremony early last night without completing the formal sign-out. I want a representative from each Western pack involved, someone with knowledge of their own pack members, for identification purposes. Barda's pen was already moving. And the representative from Crestmore? Their record keeper, Calum said. She'll have the most comprehensive knowledge of her pack's members. Her name is Sera Voss. He went back inside and closed the door. His wolf settled in his chest with the quiet satisfaction of something that had been waiting a very long time and had just identified the direction it intended to go. Methodical, Calum reminded himself. Evidence. Conclusions. He sat back down at the table, opened the folder again, and began reading everything that the kingdom's census records had on Crestmore Pack, starting, for no reason he was prepared to examine yet, with the entry on one Sera Voss, record keeper, age 24. The entry was 4 lines long: name, age, rank, pack. No additional notes, no oracle records. Those were maintained at the pack level, not the kingdom level. He made a note to request the pack's oracle files. Then he stopped, pen hovering, and thought about that. Oracle files were private. Requesting them without cause would be an overreach, the kind of thing that eroded trust between the crown and the packs, and he had spent 12 years building that trust carefully. He couldn't request oracle records for a 24-year-old record keeper based on compass needle and hair color. He put the pen down. Riven knocked and entered without waiting, which was his right as general, and which Calum had long since stopped finding irritating. The task force request. You want me to send it? Yes. Riven looked at the folder, then at Calum, with the expression of a man assembling a picture in real time. We're looking for one woman, from the ceremony, One woman, out of 700 attendees. Yes. May I ask why? She left before the formal close. Several dozen people left before the formal close. She's the one I'm asking about. Riven was quiet for a moment. Calum watched him work through the options, push further, which would accomplish nothing, accept the answer, which was the only viable path, or land on the obvious conclusion, which was what his general was doing right now, judging by the extremely careful neutrality that had descended over his face. I'll send the request this morning, Riven said. Send it by royal courier, priority designation. Yes, Your Majesty. After he left, Calum stood at the window and looked out at Valdenmere in the mid-morning light. The rooftops, the market streets, the distant glint of the river. Somewhere in the western quarter, the delegations from the western packs were preparing to travel home. The ceremony was over. The kingdom would return to its regular rhythms. He thought about dark eyes, wide with terror for one unguarded second. He thought about the way she'd pulled her arm free, not violently, not obviously, with the precision of someone who had rehearsed detachment. He thought about his wolf saying there, quiet and absolute, after 12 years of silence. She ran from you, he thought. Not a complaint. More of an observation, turned over and examined. She knew who you were, and she ran. That was the part he couldn't quite set aside, and he'd been trying since midnight. Not the attraction. He could categorize and set aside attraction. He'd done it often enough. What he couldn't set aside was the running. Because his wolf's recognition meant she was likely his mate, and a mate didn't run from an alpha king because she was indifferent. She ran because she was afraid, and that meant something had frightened her, something specific. He wanted to know what. That was it, he decided. That was the full scope of his interest. A methodical man identifying an anomaly and wanting to understand it. No more complicated than that. He turned from the window. On the desk, the folder with Sera Voss's 4-line census entry sat open in the morning light. He picked it up, read it one more time. Record keeper, Crestmore Pack, age 24, and closed it carefully. The royal courier would reach Crestmore in 2 days. He was patient. He had ruled for 12 years. He knew how to wait. But across the city, in a room above a bakery that smelled of bread and early autumn, a woman was packing a travel case with a green dress and an ivory mask, and she would be halfway home before the courier ever left the palace gates, and she had no idea that the thing she was running from was already running after her, methodically, with all the resources of the Ironvale Kingdom, and the focused attention of a man who had just broken his own third rule completely. 2 days later, in Crestmore, Pack Elder Doran received the royal summons and walked to the back office where Sera was refiling the quarterly census records, and stood in the doorway with an expression she had never seen on his face in 8 years. Something between apology and alarm. "Sera," he said, "there's a letter." She looked up. "For the pack?" "For you." A pause. "From the palace." The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees. The river made its patient sound in the distance. The third cabinet from the left, where she had filed her oracle records 2 years ago under O for Oracle, specifically for situations like this, stood slightly open, the way it always did when the latch didn't catch properly. "What does it say?" she asked. Doran held it out. She crossed the room and took it and read it. And the words were formal and clear and completely, utterly, catastrophically reasonable. A task force. A missing ceremony attendee. Representatives from the Western packs. Knowledge of pack members required. The record keeper of Crestmore Pack is hereby requested to present herself at the royal capital within 5 days, where she will assist in identifying. Sera stopped reading. She read the last line again. The masked woman last seen departing the great hall before the ceremony's formal close. The Alpha King requests your assistance personally. She stood very still. "Sera?" Doran said. She folded the letter carefully. Precisely. Along the original crease lines, then in half again, then in half once more, until it was a small square that she held between both hands. "I'll need to repack my travel case," she said. Her voice was completely steady. She was getting very good at that. Chapter 3. The royal courier who had delivered the summons offered to escort her back to Valdenmere, which Sera declined politely, because she needed the 2-day cart journey to do something she was very bad at. Panic productively. She sat in the back of the cart, same route, same gray wool blanket over her knees against the autumn chill, and she thought. Not about whether to go. That wasn't a choice. The letter had a royal seal on it, and she had seen what happened to pack members who ignored royal seals. Not in Crestmore, which was too small and too far west for that kind of consequence, but in the kingdom records she maintained. It was not a category of outcome she intended to explore personally. So she was going. The question was how. She ran the problem the way she ran difficult ledger discrepancies. Strip it to its components, identify where the numbers didn't balance, find the correction. Component 1. The Alpha King was looking for a masked woman in an emerald gown who left the ceremony early. Component 2. Sera was that woman. Component 3. Sera was now being asked to help find that woman. Component 4. The Alpha King had caught her arm in the courtyard. He had been close enough to... She pressed this thought flat immediately. Close enough to potentially register something. A scent. A feature. Some detail that might, in the right lighting, with the mask removed. She stopped. Does he know? She turned the question over carefully, the way you turn a blade to check for nicks. If he knew, the letter would have been different. It would not have been a task force request. It would have been something else. Something with less procedural courtesy and more direct authority. The Alpha King did not, based on everything she knew about him from 12 years of kingdom records, strike her as a man who built elaborate frameworks around things he was certain of. He built elaborate frameworks around things he was investigating. So he didn't know. Not yet. He suspected. Which was almost worse, because suspicion in a methodical man was just knowledge waiting to be organized. She had 2 days to figure out how to stand in front of him and help him look for herself without him finding her. She pulled the gray wool blanket tighter and watched the pine trees move past and thought, "You have spent 8 years becoming invisible. This is just that, with higher stakes." She almost believed it. Enki was waiting at the entrance to the Western delegation lodgings when she arrived, which was both surprising and, she found, a small relief. He was holding 2 cups of something hot and had the expression of a person who had been expecting her. "You got a letter too," she said. "I got a letter too." He handed her one of the cups. It was tea, strong, slightly too bitter, the kind that required full attention. "I'm apparently the representative from Dusk Hollow Pack for this task force, by virtue of having been at the ceremony and being the only person from my pack Elder could spare." He paused. "Also, I think Elder Garvey was pleased to have me out of the healing hall for a few more days. I reorganized the herb cabinet last week, and I don't think he's forgiven me yet." Sera wrapped both hands around the cup. "How many representatives are there?" 6 total. 2 from the eastern packs, 4 from the west. He fell into step beside her as she moved toward the lodging's entrance. "They're holding the first meeting this afternoon. In the palace. A beat. Have you been to the palace before?" "No. Neither have I. I walked past it this morning and felt genuinely intimidated by a building, which is a new experience." He held the door open for her. "Are you all right? You look like someone who's been thinking very hard for a very long time." 2 days in a cart," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way that suggested he was being tactfully quiet, rather than actually quiet. "Sera. Why do you think they want a record keeper for an identification task force? Specifically," he kept his voice light, purely conversational, utterly non-accusatory. "I mean, it makes sense on the surface, knowledge of pack members, who was at the ceremony, etc. But there are pack elders from Crestmore who would have more authority on that front. And the letter went directly to you." Sera took a long sip of tea. "I maintain the census records," she said. "I know everyone in the pack by name and physical description. It's a reasonable choice." Said Enki. "It's a completely reasonable administrative choice." "Absolutely," he agreed. They reached the door to her room. She stopped, key in hand. "Enki." She looked at him. He looked back at her with his round, pleasant face and his genuinely kind eyes, and the expression of someone who had already assembled most of a picture and was simply waiting politely for the last piece. She made a decision. It was probably a terrible decision, but she was 2 days' journey from home, walking into a palace to help a king find herself, and she had no allies and no plan, and the tea was too bitter, and she was tired of doing everything alone. "What I tell you," she said carefully, "stays between us." He nodded immediately. No hesitation. She noted that. "If I told you that the masked woman from the ceremony was someone who had a very good reason for not being found, a reason that had nothing to do with anything criminal or harmful, and that finding her would cause significant damage to someone who genuinely cannot afford to be damaged right now, I would say," Enki said, with the same careful evenness, "that I am a healer's assistant. My entire professional framework is built around the principle that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is protect them from a situation their body, or their life, genuinely cannot survive." He paused. "I'd also say that I'm quite good at not seeing things I'm not supposed to see. It's an underrated skill in medical work." Sera looked at him for a long moment. "She had a prophecy," she said quietly. "The masked woman, an oracle's mark. The bond that finds her will be the bond that kills her." Enki was very still. "The Alpha King's bond," he said. "Any Alpha's bond, but yes." She looked at her key. "Specifically, the first Alpha who truly sees her. That's the oracle's language. Triggers a bond that will burn her alive from the inside. Her wolf can't survive it. The energy is too much for her to contain." The corridor was quiet. Somewhere below, the city moved through its afternoon sounds. Cartwheels, voices, the distant percussion of a market. "So she ran," Enki said. "So she ran. And now the Alpha King is looking for her, and has asked her to help him look." Enki was quiet for a moment that stretched just long enough to let the full architecture of the situation settle. "That," he said finally, with great restraint, "is a very significant problem." "Yes. Do you need me to?" He stopped. Started again. "What do you need?" "Right now? I need to go to this meeting, and not be recognized, and help them look in every direction except the right one." She turned the key in the lock. "After that, I need to find a way to close this investigation before it gets anywhere close to a conclusion. And if it does get close?" She pushed the door open. "Then I'll deal with that when it happens," she said, because it was the only answer she had. She went inside. She did not look in the mirror that hung on the wall opposite the door. She already knew what she'd see. The same face she'd been hiding for 8 years, a little more tired than usual, wearing the particular expression of someone standing at the exact edge of the thing they've always been afraid of. She changed into fresh clothes, pinned her hair up flat against her skull, put on her most forgettable gray dress, and went to the palace. The task force met in a room called the Amber Chamber, which was smaller than Sera had expected, a working room rather than a ceremonial one, with a long oak table and maps on the walls and the practical, worn atmosphere of a space that was used for actual thinking rather than display. She was the last to arrive. 5 other representatives sat along one side of the table, 2 women and a man from the Eastern Pax, a broad-shouldered older man she didn't recognize, and Enki, who had somehow arrived before her and claimed the seat at the far end, leaving the one nearest the door open. She sat in it. At the head of the table, General Riven stood with a folder and the expression of a military man conducting a briefing, efficient, focused, fundamentally uninterested in anything that wasn't directly relevant to the objective. And at the far end of the table, not at the head, deliberately not at the head, she registered, in the chair positioned slightly to the side, the chair of an observer rather than a leader. The Alpha King. He was reviewing a document and did not look up when she entered. Sera sat down and put her hands in her lap and made her face into the face she wore for council meetings, attentive, neutral, competent, forgettable. She had a very specific internal word for this face, adequate. She was trying to look precisely adequate. She did not look at him. She would not look at him. General Riven opened the briefing. "Thank you all for attending on short notice. The situation is straightforward. At the great mating ceremony 3 nights passed, an attendee departed the hall before the formal close of proceedings, without completing the sign-out register. Under normal circumstances, this would be a minor administrative matter. However, he paused precisely long enough. There are reasons to believe this individual may be significant to the crown, and the Alpha King has authorized a formal identification effort. Significant to the crown. Sera noted the phrasing. Careful, non-specific. We have the following details. Riven set a sheet on the table. Female, approximately 5 feet 4 to 5 feet 6 in height. Dark hair, worn loose. The ivory and gold mask she wore has been identified as merchant purchased, common design, sold by at least 3 vendors in the Western Market District. Her gown was emerald silk. She was seen in the alcove section along the left wall of the Great Hall, between the first and second bells. She departed through the side exit shortly before the second bell, and was last seen in the eastern courtyard. He looked up. We are asking each of you to review the attendance records from your respective packs and identify any women matching this description who were present at the ceremony. The review should take no more than 2 days. Any candidates are to be reported directly to this office. Silence. Sera looked at the sheet on the table. She picked it up. She read the description of herself with the calm, professional attention of a record keeper reviewing a document. Dark hair, worn loose, emerald silk gown, ivory and gold mask. The description was accurate and almost entirely useless. Half the women at the ceremony had dark hair, and the gown and mask were purchased items that could have come from anywhere. She set the sheet down. How many women in the Western packs match this general description? She asked. Her voice came out exactly right. Not too engaged, not too detached. Riven looked at her. That's partly what we need your assistance to determine. Roughly, she said, meeting his eyes with the specific mild persistence of someone asking a clarifying question for professional reasons. If we're talking dark hair, average height, that describes perhaps 30 to 40% of the female attendees. Is there any additional identifying detail that might narrow the field? Scent, distinguishing feature, anything from the courtyard encounter? She felt, rather than saw, the Alpha King look up from his document. She did not look at him. Riven glanced toward the end of the table, the slight flicker of a man checking his superior's preference. Her eyes, said a voice. Low, even, not unkind. She had heard it say 4 words in a courtyard, and her brain had apparently decided to memorize the exact timbre and cadence of it, because she recognized it before the sentence was finished. She made herself turn her head with the same pace and angle she would use to look at anyone else speaking at a meeting. The Alpha King was looking at the document in front of him. Her eyes, he said again, without looking up. One knot. Not brown, darker than that. And she had a way of watching the room from the sides, not the center. Peripheral attention. Like someone accustomed to observing without being observed. A brief pause. That's a habit, not a physical feature. But it's the kind of thing that distinguishes her from a woman who simply happened to stand near a column. The room was quiet. Sera looked back at her copy of the description sheet. She wrote, in small, even letters in the margin of her notepad, peripheral attention, observational habit. Then she wrote, below that, what else does he remember? Then she put her pen down before she could write anything else. That's helpful, she said, in her adequate voice. I'll cross-reference against what I know of the Crestmore attendees. Good, said Riven. The Alpha King went back to his document. Sera looked at the map on the wall above his head, a detailed rendering of the Western Territories, Crestmore marked with a small dot at the far edge, and felt her wolf turn over again in the back of her mind, slow and warm, like something trying to surface. Stop, she thought, very clearly. Her wolf stilled, but the warmth remained, quiet and stubborn, a small ember she couldn't quite put out. The meeting lasted an hour. Sera took notes. Meticulous, comprehensive notes. She asked 3 clarifying questions, all of them professionally reasonable. She made 2 suggestions about cross-referencing the attendance records against the sign-out register to identify who hadn't completed formal departure, which would narrow the field considerably. Riven wrote both suggestions down. The Alpha King listened without commenting, but she was aware, the way you are aware of a heat source in a cold room without looking directly at it, that his attention moved to her when she spoke. Not obtrusively, not in a way anyone else at the table would necessarily notice. But she noticed. She noticed, and she cataloged it, and she filed it in the part of her mind labeled problems that will require management, and she kept her voice level, and her posture neutral, and her face adequate. She was doing well. She was doing very, very well. And then, as the meeting concluded and the representatives began gathering their notes, the Alpha King stood, and the room did the thing Enki had described, the thing about getting heavier, and he walked toward the door, which was also the door she was walking toward, because she had specifically chosen the seat nearest the exit. They reached it at the same time. He held it open. She looked up, because there was no way to not look up that wouldn't be more obvious than looking up, and she said, "Thank you," in her adequate voice, and she walked through. In the corridor, she kept walking, measured pace, professional. Behind her, she heard his footsteps. Then they stopped. "You're the record keeper," he said. She turned, 6 feet of corridor between them. She kept her hands loose at her sides. Yes, Sera Voss, Crestmore Pack. He looked at her. She met his eyes for exactly the length of time a person looks at someone when there's nothing to hide. "You have good instincts for investigation," he said. "The cross-referencing approach, that's the right method. It would have taken Riven another day to arrive at it." "I work with records," she said. "It's the obvious approach when you're looking for an absence." A pause. "Yes," he said. "Exactly that." He was looking at her with the methodical attention of a man examining something he hasn't categorized yet, and Sera stood in the corridor and was gray and forgettable and adequately professional, and gave him absolutely nothing to categorize. "I'll have my preliminary report by tomorrow morning," she said. He nodded once. She turned and walked. She made it to the end of the corridor, around the corner, and 3 steps down the next hallway before she stopped and pressed her back against the stone wall and closed her eyes and breathed. Her hands, she noticed, were not shaking. She was choosing to count that as a victory. Because what she could not let herself count, what she could not examine, even for a second, because examining it would make it real, was the expression on his face in those last few seconds. Not suspicion, not recognition. Something quieter and more dangerous than either. Curiosity. He was curious about her. Not about the masked woman, not yet, but about the record keeper with the peripheral attention and the good investigative instincts who had walked into his task force and immediately started redirecting it. He's going to figure it out, she thought. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but he's going to figure it out. She opened her eyes. The corridor stretched ahead, stone and torchlight, perfectly ordinary. She was the lead investigator on a task force hunting herself, and the man who wanted to find her was now curious about her in 2 separate directions, and her wolf would not stop trying to surface every time she got within 6 feet of him. She pushed off the wall and walked. She needed a report that was thorough enough to look convincing, specific enough to demonstrate effort, and completely wrong in every conclusion that mattered. She needed it by tomorrow morning. She went back to her room and sat at the small desk and picked up her pen and stared at the blank paper for a long moment. Then she did the thing she had always been best at. She started working. Chapter 4. Sera's preliminary report was 4 pages long, meticulously formatted, and completely, architecturally, beautifully misleading. She had spent most of the night on it. Not on the misdirection. That part had come easily, which said something uncomfortable about her that she chose not to examine. The difficulty had been calibration. Too obvious a dead end and it would look like sabotage. Too plausible, and it might accidentally redirect the investigation toward someone real. An innocent woman from Crestmore who happened to have dark hair and a forgettable face, and no idea she was about to become the focus of royal attention. Sera had threaded the needle the only way she knew how, with precision. The report identified 3 women from the Western Packs as preliminary candidates matching the general description. 2 of them were real, genuine attendees with dark hair and no alibi for the window between the first and second bells. Women whose lives would survive minor royal scrutiny because they had nothing to hide, and therefore nothing to find. The third was a composite, assembled from partial records, technically valid but practically unverifiable in the short term. It would buy her a week, maybe 10 days. After that, she needed a different plan. She sealed the report, changed into her most forgettable gray dress. She had packed 3 of them, instinctively, like armor, and walked to the palace in the early morning before most of the city had finished waking up. Riven accepted the report with professional appreciation and the expression of a man who had not expected quite this level of output overnight. "This is thorough," he said, flipping through the pages. "I know the census records well," Sera said. "It's mostly pattern matching." He nodded, already moving toward his desk. "The other representatives are due by mid-morning with their reports. We'll consolidate and brief the king this afternoon." He set the report down. "You're welcome to attend the consolidation meeting at the 10th hour, if you're available." "I'll be there," she said. She walked back through the palace corridors toward the main entrance, past the tapestries and the high windows letting in the thin morning light, and was almost at the large entry hall when she heard footsteps behind her. Unhurried, even, the walk of someone who was not trying to catch up, but simply happened to be going the same direction. She knew those footsteps. She had, apparently, memorized those footsteps, which was new information about herself that she found deeply inconvenient. She did not slow down. She did not speed up. She continued at her precise, ordinary pace, and she did not turn around. "Miss Voss." She turned around. The Alpha King was dressed for a working morning rather than ceremony. Dark, practical clothing, no formal coat, a small stack of documents held in one hand, with the comfort of someone who carried documents around so often it had become unconscious. He looked, in this lighting, without the weight of the ceremony around him, slightly more like a person, and slightly less like an institution. She found this more difficult to manage than the ceremonial version. "Your Majesty," she said. "You delivered your report already." Not a question. He'd clearly come from Riven's direction. "I had it ready last night." He considered that. "What time did you start?" "8th hour, after dinner." This was true. She had been too unsettled to eat the dinner, but she had sat at the table in front of it. "And you finished?" "2nd hour past midnight." Something moved through his expression. Brief, controlled, there and gone. "That's efficient." "I prefer having things done," she said. "Incomplete tasks make it difficult to think about other things." He was looking at her with that careful attention again, methodical, cataloging. She held still under it, the way you hold still when a large predator is making a decision. "Walk with me for a moment," he said. This was not a request. It was phrased as one, with the practiced courtesy of a man who had spent 12 years giving instructions that were technically optional and functionally absolute. She fell into step beside him. They walked. The corridor opened into a smaller passage that ran along the inside of the palace wall, lined with narrow windows looking out onto a courtyard garden. Mostly brown now, late autumn, but with the particular quiet dignity of a space designed for thinking rather than display. "You know Crestmore well," he said. "I've lived there for 8 years. You're not originally from the pack." It wasn't quite a question. She glanced at him sideways. "The census records are thorough," she said. "I read them yesterday." Completely unapologetic. "You were born in Whitfin, Eastern Territory. You relocated to Crestmore at 16. 16, the year of the Oracle. My mother's sister lives in Crestmore," she said, which was true. "I wanted to be closer to family." "At 16, he said. "Without your parents." "My parents passed when I was 15. Also true. She had learned, in 8 years of misdirection, that the most effective lies were built on a frame of truth. They carried the right weight, withstood the right amount of pressure. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. He said it with the even simplicity of someone who meant it without performing it. No additional weight. No glance to check whether the condolence had landed correctly. "Thank you," she said. They walked for a moment in silence. The garden below the windows had a stone bench, and a tree that must have been spectacular in spring, and a small fountain that had been shut off for the season. Sera looked at it without really seeing it. "The cross-referencing method you suggested yesterday," he said. "I want to apply it differently." She kept her pace even. "How so?" "Instead of identifying who didn't sign out, which is the obvious approach, and which would have been done already if it were going to work, I want to look at the sign-in records. Specifically, I want to identify attendees who signed in, but whose sign-in time doesn't match the registration order for their delegation. He paused. Someone who arrived separately from their pack group, or who registered at an unusual time. Sera walked for 3 more steps before she understood what he was describing. She had signed in separately from the Crestmore delegation. She had arrived 40 minutes after the main group because the cart she'd taken had had a wheel repaired on the road, and she'd walked the last half-mile and signed in late, alone, at the overflow registration table rather than the main desk. Her sign-in time would be anomalous against the Crestmore group's records. She had 48 hours, perhaps less, before this approach identified her. "That's a good method," she said. Her voice was even, completely even. She was going to name this evening's performance in her memory and be proud of it later, when she was safely back in Crestmore. It would require pulling the registration ledgers from the ceremony administration office, though. "Do you have access to those?" "I have access to everything," he said, mildly. "Of course," she nodded. "I can help cross-reference if you'd like another set of eyes on the ledgers. I'm familiar with how registration records are structured. I've administered pack census events." She felt him look at her. She did not look back. "I'd appreciate that," he said. "This afternoon, after the consolidation meeting, I'll be available." They had reached the end of the passage. It opened onto the main entry hall. High ceilings, morning light through the tall windows, a handful of palace staff moving through their routines. The Alpha King stopped. Sera stopped. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Majesty?" He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Not the methodical cataloging, not the careful authority. Something more direct, like a question that hadn't found its words yet. "Why did you volunteer?" he said. "To help with the ledgers. You've already submitted a comprehensive report. Your obligation to this task force is largely fulfilled." She met his eyes. "Because I'm a record keeper," she said. "Incomplete searches bother me." It was the truest lie she had ever told. She was going to help him search the ledgers because she needed to be in the room when he found the anomaly, so she could manage what happened when he did. He looked at her for 1 second longer than was strictly conversational. "Good," he said, and then, "Your eyes are an unusual color. I noticed yesterday." The world went very quiet. "Dark," she said, carefully. "Yes, but specifically, darker at the center, lighter at the edge." He said it with the flat precision of someone stating an observation, not paying a compliment. "It's distinctive." She held very still. "He's cataloging you," she thought. "That's all. He's thorough, and he's cataloging you." "I've never particularly noticed," she said. "No," he said, with the smallest possible inflection that managed to convey, "I find that unlikely without saying it." He nodded once, the brief formal acknowledgement, and walked back the way they'd come. Sera stood in the entry hall and watched him go and did not breathe for approximately 10 seconds. Then she turned, walked out of the palace, crossed the courtyard, went through the gate, and sat on a low stone wall 50 yards from the palace entrance, in the pale autumn sunlight. She sat there for 5 minutes. She was running a calculation, the ledger problem specifically. If she helped him review the ledgers this afternoon, she could manage the discovery, guide it, make the anomaly seem like an administrative error from the overflow table, rather than a deliberate late arrival. She had enough knowledge of how registration records worked to make that case convincingly. But that required being in a room with him, alone or nearly alone, looking at records together, for an extended period of time. She thought about darker at the center, lighter at the edge, said in that flat, precise voice. She thought about her wolf, who was doing something now that she had no good word for, not quite surfacing, not quite still, a kind of restless warmth that hadn't been there a week ago and was becoming harder to ignore. "He's going to find you," she thought. "If not today, tomorrow. If not tomorrow, next week. You can manage the ledgers today and buy yourself more time, but eventually the mathematics of this situation are going to resolve in only one direction." She needed to make sure that when they did, she was already gone. The consolidation meeting lasted 2 hours. The other representatives produced their reports with varying levels of thoroughness. The Eastern PAC representatives had done competent but surface-level work. The older, broad-shouldered man had managed one genuine candidate worth investigating, and Enki had submitted a report so beautifully comprehensive and so entirely unhelpful to the actual investigation that Sera suspected he'd spent approximately the same number of hours on it that she had, for opposite reasons. She looked at him across the table. He met her eyes briefly and returned to his notes with the serene expression of someone thinking about something completely unrelated. Riven consolidated the reports with brisk efficiency. 3 primary candidates, 4 secondary possibilities, and the new ledger approach to be pursued this afternoon. The Alpha King has requested that the ledger review be conducted today, Riven said, given the timeline. Miss Voss has agreed to assist, given her familiarity with registration record formats. He looked around the table. The rest of you are released for the day. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning with any findings. The room emptied. Enki passed her on the way out, and his hand very briefly touched her elbow, not stopping, not drawing attention, just a touch that meant, be careful in the language of someone who had decided to be on her side. She was grateful for it in a way she didn't have the space to process right now. The ceremony administration office was in a quieter wing of the palace, a large, organized room staffed by 3 archivists who produced the registration ledgers with the reverence of people who considered paperwork sacred. Sera understood that feeling completely. Under different circumstances, she might have enjoyed this room. The Alpha King arrived 5 minutes after her, without Riven, which she had not anticipated, and immediately needed to adjust for. She had assumed Riven would be present. A third party changed the calibration of everything. The ledgers, he said to the archivist, who placed them on the long reading table without needing further direction. There were 6 of them, thick, leather-bound, 1 for each registration desk. Sera looked at them and identified, immediately, which one contained the overflow table records. 4th from the left. She sat down at the table. He sat across from her, slightly to the right, close enough to share documents, far enough to be appropriate. She pulled the first ledger toward her and opened it. I'll start from the west, you start from the east, she suggested. We're looking for sign-in times that fall outside the clustering pattern for their pack group. He nodded, already opening the last ledger. They worked. The room was quiet except for the turning of pages and the scratch of Sera's pen as she made notes. The archivists moved in the background with professional silence. Outside, Valdenmere went about its afternoon. It was fine. It was manageable. She was a record keeper reviewing ledgers with another person. She had done this 100 times. The person across from her happened to be the Alpha King, and happened to be, possibly, the person she was fated to destroy her own life with. But that was a contextual detail she was setting aside. She was on the 3rd ledger when his hand crossed the table. Not reaching for her, reaching for the pen she'd set down at the table's edge, which had rolled slightly toward him. He picked it up and held it out. She reached for it, and her fingers closed over it at the same moment his did. Contact, 2 seconds, maybe 3, of his hand against hers. It was not dramatic. It was a pen. She had touched hundreds of pens. She had made incidental contact with dozens of people, and felt nothing notable. This was not that. It moved through her like a struck bell, a resonance that started at the point of contact and traveled outward in slow, even waves, and her wolf, who had been doing that restless, warm thing for 3 days, went suddenly and completely still. Not dormant, not sleeping. Listening. She pulled her hand back. She hoped at normal speed, she believed at normal speed, and said, "Thank you," in her adequate voice, and looked back at her ledger. Across the table, he had gone still too. Not the stillness of someone who felt nothing. The stillness of someone managing a reaction. She did not look up. She turned a page. She read the next column of names and times with the focused attention of someone who was absolutely fine. It was a pen, she told herself. It was 2 seconds. You're fine. Her wolf disagreed, quietly and thoroughly. She was 2 pages from the overflow table section of the 3rd ledger, the one she would need to reach before he did, or redirect him away from, because the overflow table records were in the 4th ledger and she needed to review them first, when he spoke. "This is interesting." She looked up. He was looking at the ledger in front of him. The 6th, the Eastern records, with the expression of someone who had found something unexpected. "What is it?" she asked. "One of the Eastern Pack candidates you identified in your report, the second one." He turned the ledger toward her. "Her sign-in time is anomalous, but not in the way I was expecting." Sera looked at the page. Her own report, her own carefully chosen candidate. One of the two real women she'd included to give the investigation plausible forward momentum. She had chosen this woman because she was a valid candidate who would, under scrutiny, prove definitively not to be the masked woman. She had left the ceremony with her pack group, verifiably, before the relevant window. Clean negative result. But the sign-in time Sera now looked at was wrong. Not the time she had built her analysis on, an hour earlier. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the time. She looked at the entry above it and the entry below it, and ran the numbers in her head. The woman's pack group had signed in as a unit at the 4th hour. This entry showed her individually at the 3rd hour, before her group arrived. That wasn't what Sera had found in the census records. That wasn't the data she'd worked from. There was a discrepancy between the ceremony ledger and the census records she'd used for her report. Small, significant. She had almost sent an innocent woman into investigative scrutiny based on a data error. "That's a ledger discrepancy," she said, and her voice was not quite as even as she would have liked. "Her census record shows a different arrival time. Someone made an entry error, either here or in the census transfer." He was looking at her. She became aware that he was looking at her. "How did you know what her census record shows?" he said. "From memory?" She had 14 Crestmore women's details in her head. She had their records, because she'd reviewed them the night before she came here. She had this specific woman's time memorized, because she'd used it in her report. "I reviewed all the Crestmore records extensively before submitting my report," she said. "I tend to retain figures. You retain census entry times for your pack members. I retain most things I review for work." He was very still. "Miss Voss," he said, with the quiet evenness of someone turning something over in their hands. "How long have you been a record keeper?" 8 years. "And before that?" "I was 16. I didn't have a profession before that." "What drew you to record keeping?" She looked at him directly. "I find it calming," she said. "Things either match or they don't. The discrepancy either resolves or it points to something. There's no ambiguity." He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly too long. "Yes," he said, "exactly." And something about the way he said it, the way exactly landed, the same word he'd used in the corridor that morning, with the same brief quality of someone recognizing something, made the back of her neck go warm. He picked up his pen. He looked back at the ledger. "We should keep going," he said. "We have 3 more ledgers." "Yes," she said. She pulled the 4th ledger toward her. Chapter 5. She got to the overflow section first. It was not graceful. It was not subtle. She turned the pages of the 4th ledger with the precise, unhurried pace of a professional reviewing records, and when she reached the overflow table section, tucked into the back third of the ledger, smaller handwriting, slightly different ink from a different pen at a different desk, she found her own entry in approximately 30 seconds. Voss, S. Crestmore Pack, sign in, 4th hour, 43rd minute. The Crestmore group had signed in at the 4th hour, 2nd minute. 41 minutes difference. Flagged, in the margin, in small pencil notation by whatever archivist had done the initial review, late arrival, overflow desk. She looked at it for 2 seconds. Then she took her pen, made a small notation in her own review notes. Overflow table, late arrivals, administrative separation from group, not behavioral anomaly, and turned the page. She reviewed the rest of the overflow section. 3 other late arrivals from Western packs, all with pencil notations similar to hers. She made notes on all of them, identical in tone and depth to the note she'd made on her own entry. Then she reached the end of the ledger, closed it, and set it aside. "The overflow table section," she said, without looking up from her notes, "has 4 late arrivals from Western packs, all flagged by the original archivist as administrative separations. They arrived after their group and registered at the secondary desk. I'd recommend we rule those out as behavioral anomalies. The late arrival pattern is explained by the overflow procedure itself." She heard him turn a page. "Which packs?" She listed them, including Crestmore. 4 packs, 4 names, equal weight, nothing distinguished. And the specific individuals? She listed the names, her own, third in the sequence. A pause. I'll note them for secondary review, he said. Secondary, not primary. She filed that. Of course, she said. They worked through the last 2 ledgers. The afternoon light moved across the floor in slow degrees. The archivists brought tea at some point. Hot, adequately bitter, which Sera found grounding. She drank it without looking away from the ledger in front of her. At the 5th hour, he set down his pen. We have 1 strong candidate from the ledger review, he said. He turned his notes toward her. Western Pack, Ferngate. Woman named Dara Coalfield. Signed in with her group, signed out 40 minutes before the 2nd bell. But the sign-out register shows her escort to the east courtyard, the same direction our attendee was last seen. He paused. She matches the general description. Sera looked at the notes. Dara Coalfield, Ferngate Pack, 26 years old, dark hair, average height. She had not created this lead. He had found it independently, through the ledger review, without any of her help. She looked at it and felt, for the first time since she'd walked into the palace, the particular cold clarity of a plan beginning to fail. This is a real candidate, she thought. A real woman who will be questioned because of a 40-minute sign-out discrepancy and a direction of travel. I'll cross-reference against the Ferngate census records tonight, she said. I can request the relevant files from their representative. Do that. He picked up his pen again. If Coalfield holds up as a candidate, I'll want to meet with her. He said it with complete neutrality, no particular weight or anticipation. Sera noted that, filed it, tried very hard not to interpret it. Is there anything specific you're hoping to verify in a meeting? She asked, keeping her voice professionally curious. It might help me prepare the cross-reference. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his notes. Whether she's the right person, he said. I'll know when I meet her. His wolf, Sera thought. He means his wolf will tell him. Which meant that when Dara Coalfield stood in front of him, he would know within seconds that she wasn't the one, and that negative result would redirect his attention. Where? Back to the ledgers, back to the overflow section, back to the 4 late arrivals she'd listed with such careful equanimity. Back to Voss, S. She had perhaps 3 days. Enki was waiting outside the palace gate, which had graduated from coincidence to pattern. Walk? He said. They walked, through the late afternoon streets of Valdenmere, past the market stalls folding up for the evening, past the bakeries and the lamplighters beginning their rounds. How bad, he said, when they were far enough from the palace. There's a real candidate, she said. He found her independently. She'll be ruled out within minutes of meeting him, and then the investigation pivots back to the ledger review, and I'm in the overflow section under my own name. Enki was quiet for a moment. Timeline? 3 days, possibly 4, if the Coalfield meeting takes time to arrange. And then? And then I'm either gone, back to Crestmore, formally released from the task force, or I'm answering questions I can't answer. Can you get released from the task force before the Coalfield meeting? She had thought about this, not without a reason. I submitted a comprehensive report. I've been actively contributing. Leaving now looks like something. Because it is something. Yes. She watched a lamplighter climb his ladder. The flame caught, and a small circle of gold appeared in the early dark. I need to slow the Coalfield meeting, not stop it. Stopping it would be suspicious. Just delay it long enough to complete my task force obligation, and request release on the grounds that my contribution is substantially fulfilled. How do you slow a meeting the Alpha King has decided to have? Ferngate Pack is 3 days' ride from Valdenmere. The request to bring Coalfield to the capital has to go through her pack elder, who has to release her from pack duties, who has to arrange the travel. She had been working through this since the moment he'd said, I'll want to meet with her. If the formal request is submitted through the correct procedural channels, rather than by royal courier, regular messenger, standard form, appropriate processing time, can you control how the request is submitted? I'm a member of the task force with access to the administrative process. She paused. It's not falsification. It's procedure. The correct procedure, applied exactly as it should be. Enki considered this. You're going to make the bureaucracy work at exactly the speed bureaucracy is designed to work at. Yes. That's very elegant. Thank you. They walked a little further. There's another option, Enki said, in the careful tone of someone raising something they're not sure will be well received. You could tell him. Sera said nothing. I know, he said. The prophecy. But, Sera, oracles aren't always... She said it very clearly, Sera said, sitting down, no ceremony, in her back office, like she was reading me a weather report. The bond that finds you will be the bond that kills you. That's not ambiguous. Oracles speak in the language of probability, not certainty. The outcome she described, is it possible she meant something other than literal death? Sera thought about the oracle. 60 years old, dry-voiced, unbothered, the way she'd said not a metaphor, child with the specific weariness of someone who had watched people try to make metaphors out of her prophecies too many times. She was very specific about the not a metaphor part, Sera said. Right, a pause. What did she say exactly? The full prophecy. Sera recited it. She had memorized it at 16, and she had never stopped knowing it. It was the most precisely remembered thing in her head, more reliable than any census record. The bond that finds you will be the bond that kills you. The first alpha who sees you, truly sees you, will trigger a mate bond so powerful it will burn you alive from the inside out. Your wolf cannot hold that much power. It will consume her trying. Enki walked quietly for a moment. The first alpha who truly sees you, he repeated. Yes. What does truly sees mean, in oracle language? She had spent 8 years not asking this question, because asking it felt like looking for an exit from something she'd already accepted. It means recognizes, sees past the surface, the full recognition of a mate bond. Has he, Enki paused, has the Alpha King looked at you the way you'd describe as truly seeing you? She thought about the corridor, darker at the center, lighter at the edge. She thought about the archive room, his hand on hers, the way he'd gone still. He's close, she said quietly. But not there yet. No, not yet. Then you still have time. That's what I'm using it for. They reached the corner where their lodgings diverged. Enki stopped. For what it's worth, he said, I think he knows something is happening. Not who you are, but something. He looked at her with the careful, honest attention of a very good healer's assistant. His wolf is awake. Whatever he felt at the ceremony, it hasn't gone quiet. I've been watching him in the meetings and he's... A pause. He's looking for something. All the time. Even when he's looking at the ledgers. I know, she said. And his attention keeps finding you. I know that too. She said goodnight and walked to her lodgings and climbed the stairs and sat on her bed in her most forgettable gray dress and looked at her hands for a long time. Her wolf was doing the warm, restless thing again. It had been doing it consistently since the archive room, since the pen, since 2 seconds of contact that shouldn't have meant anything and had meant something she didn't have a safe container for. Stop, she thought, without much force behind it. Her wolf ignored her. For the first time in 8 years, her wolf ignored her. The formal request to Ferngate Pack went through the standard administrative channel. Sera submitted it herself, through the task force administrative process, correctly and completely, with precisely the appropriate form, routing it through the regional messenger network, rather than the royal courier system. She did this because it was procedurally correct, and because it bought her 5 days instead of 2. She told herself it was entirely the former reason. On the second day of waiting, the task force convened for a progress update, and Sera sat in the amber chamber and delivered a thorough analysis of the ledger review findings, and felt the Alpha King's attention move to her when she spoke, and did not look at him directly. On the third day, the Ferngate representative brought additional information about Dara Coalfield. She had left the ceremony with a group, verifiably, and had been seen at the eastern courtyard entrance, which matched the last known location of the masked woman. The investigation was building. Sera managed the building carefully, like controlled water. On the 4th day, everything went wrong. It was not a catastrophe. It was a coincidence, which was somehow worse. Catastrophes you could plan for, but coincidences arrived without appointment and didn't care about your timeline. She was in the palace library, using the access granted to task force members to review historical ceremony records, a legitimate activity, providing additional context for the investigation, when the door opened and a woman walked in. Sera had never met Duchess Mariana of Castelvale, but she recognized her the way you recognize a category before you identify the specific instance. Beautiful, expensively dressed, carrying herself with the particular ease of someone for whom rooms have always rearranged themselves. Dark hair, though much more elaborately styled than Sera's. Approximately her height. About her age. The Duchess looked at her briefly, the flicker of a well-bred person acknowledging someone of lesser rank, and moved toward the far shelves. Sera looked back at her records. 15 minutes later, the Alpha King walked in. He was alone, which was unusual. She had never seen him without Riven or a staff member nearby. He looked like a man who had come to the library for the same reason she had, not because he needed it, but because it was quiet. He saw the Duchess. Something moved through his expression, not the warmth she might have expected from a man encountering a beautiful woman in a quiet library, but a kind of polite recognition. He knew her. "Mariana," he said. "Calum." The Duchess turned from the shelves with a smile that was calibrated very precisely, warm enough to suggest intimacy, controlled enough to suggest discretion. "I heard about your investigation, finding the mysterious masked woman." She tilted her head. "Romantic. Administrative," he said. She laughed softly. "Of course." Her eyes moved briefly to Sera. "Is this one of your investigators?" "Miss Voss, task force representative from Crestmore." The Duchess looked at her more carefully now, the assessment of a woman deciding how much attention something warrants. Her gaze moved over Sera's gray dress, her flat hair, her deliberately forgettable face. "How interesting," she said, in the tone of someone saying it isn't. She looked back at the Alpha King. "I was actually hoping to find you," she said, moving toward the door with the ease of someone used to redirecting conversations through the medium of locomotion. "My father wanted me to speak with you about the Castelvale trade agreement. Do you have a moment?" He glanced across the room, and his eyes stopped on Sera for a beat. "I'll be brief," he said, to Sera. "Don't let me interrupt your work." They left. Sera looked at the historical records in front of her. She should feel relieved. The Duchess was everything she was not. High-born, visible, making no effort whatsoever to be invisible. A far more plausible candidate for the Alpha King's attention under normal circumstances. An obvious redirect. She felt, instead, something she absolutely was not entitled to feel. Something that had no place in the careful architecture of her survival plan. She felt, "No," she thought, sharp and immediate. "You do not get to feel that. You are not allowed." She gathered her records. She stood. She left the library through the opposite door. The Duchess Mariana presented herself formally as a candidate for identification the following morning. Sera learned this from Enki, who had a gift for collecting information in the manner of someone who simply happened to be standing near things when they were said. She came forward herself, he said, over bitter tea in the lodging's common room, approached Rivan directly. Said she'd heard about the investigation and thought she might match the description. Dark hair, attended the ceremony, was near the left wall at one point. He paused. She was wearing a red gown, apparently. She checked and confirmed she owns an ivory and gold mask, purchased last year for a solstice event. Sera set her cup down. "She's not the right woman," she said. "No," Enki agreed. "But she'll be brought in for a formal meeting with the king today, and if his wolf rules her out, then the investigation returns to the ledgers." She had known this was coming. "How long is the meeting?" "Scheduled for the second hour." It was currently the first hour and 40 minutes. "Right," she said. She went back to her room, sat at the small desk, and made herself think clearly. The Coalfield meeting was still 5 days away. The Mariana meeting was today, and it would end in a negative result, and that negative result would create momentum. A failed candidate tended to sharpen focus rather than diffuse it. She opened her notepad. She looked at the 4 names in the overflow section. Voss, S. She stared at it. Then she closed the notepad. She picked up her pen, set it down, picked it up again. She began writing. Not a misdirection, not a ledger review, not an administrative procedure. She wrote quickly, in her neat small hand, filling most of a page. Then she folded it in half. She sat there holding it. What she'd written was a withdrawal from the task force. Formal, professional, adequate reason. Her preliminary report was submitted. The ledger review was complete. Her Crestmore PAC obligations required her return. Request for formal release at the end of the current week. If she submitted it today, before the Mariana meeting concluded, she could be legitimately out of Valdenmere within 4 days. The investigation would continue. It would eventually arrive at Coalfield, who would be ruled out, and then at the overflow section. When it arrived at Voss, she would be in Crestmore. The Crown would send a formal inquiry to PAC Elder Doran, and Doran would conduct it through proper channels, and there would be procedural delay, and more delay, and at some point the whole thing would slow under its own administrative weight. It wasn't permanent, it wasn't clean, but it bought time. Time for what, she wasn't entirely sure, more time being alive, which had always been her primary objective. She picked up the folded letter. She carried it to the palace. Riven accepted her withdrawal request without visible surprise, which told her he might have been expecting it. He said he would review it and provide a formal response within the day. Standard procedure. She walked back through the palace corridor. She was passing the wing that held the smaller reception rooms when the door to one of them opened. The Duchess Mariana walked out. She was smiling, but it was the smile of a woman who had just received a polite and final answer to a question she'd been trying to ask for some time. There was no devastation in it. The Duchess was too composed for devastation. But there was something resigned behind the courtesy. The Alpha King was in the doorway. He looked at Mariana's retreating back for a moment, then his gaze came up, down the corridor, across the space, and landed on Sera. She had stopped. She wasn't sure when she had stopped walking. He looked at her. She was standing in the corridor in her most forgettable gray dress, with her hair flat against her skull, and her face arranged in its most adequate expression. And he looked at her, across 20 feet of palace corridor, through the mid-morning light from the high windows, with the particular arrested quality she recognized from the ceremony. The compass needle. She could feel it from here. She could feel his wolf finding direction and settling. The warmth in her own chest was immediate and answering, her own wolf rising without permission, and she pressed it down hard. His eyes moved. A specific movement. Not away, not distracted, deliberate. A man controlling where his gaze went, because where it naturally wanted to go was something he hadn't categorized yet, and methodical men didn't act on uncategorized things. He looked back at the doorway. He stepped back into the room. The door closed. Sera stood in the corridor for 3 seconds. Then she walked away. Behind her, she did not hear the door open again. She did not hear footsteps. She made it to the end of the corridor, and around the corner, and down the stairs, and out into the pale autumn courtyard. She stood in the courtyard and breathed. He had looked at her like that in the corridor. Not at the masked woman, at her. At gray dress, flat hair, forgettable Sera Voss, record keeper. Adequately adequate. His wolf had found the direction, and she had felt it from 20 feet away, and her own wolf had answered and she had pushed it down and it had gone, but not easily, not the way it used to. She had submitted her withdrawal. She needed to be out of Valdenmere in 4 days. Because if she wasn't, if she stayed 1 day too long, if he found one more piece, if there was one more moment in a corridor, or an archive room, or a library, your wolf cannot hold that much power. It will consume her trying. She needed to go home. She needed to go home right now. Chapter 6. Her withdrawal request was denied. Not cruelly, not arbitrarily. It arrived back on her desk, the small writing table in her room above the bakery, the following morning, in an envelope with the palace seal, in Riven's efficient hand. Miss Voss, your contribution to this task force has been invaluable, and your request for release is noted. However, given the investigation's current critical phase and the pending Coalfield identification meeting, the Alpha King requests that all task force members remain available through the conclusion of the primary identification process. Estimated timeline, 7 to 10 days. Your cooperation is appreciated. General Riven, Office of the Crown. 7 to 10 days. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and sat in the dark she made for herself for approximately 30 seconds. Then she picked up the letter, folded it, and filed it in her travel case under problems I cannot currently solve. She was getting better at not solving things. She was not getting better at being comfortable with that. Enki found her in the market that afternoon. She had gone out for air and ended up at a stall selling dried herbs, which she was examining without any intention to purchase because the smell was grounding and she needed grounding. Denied, he said, appearing at her shoulder. Denied, she confirmed. He picked up a bundle of dried lavender, sniffed it, put it back. 7 to 10 days is a long time. I'm aware. The Coalfield meeting is in 4 days. Also aware. And after that, when Coalfield is ruled out. I know, Enki. He was quiet for a moment, the careful quiet of someone choosing their next words with the precision of a surgeon selecting an instrument. Can I tell you something? You're going to anyway. I've been watching him, he said. At the meetings, in the corridors. Yesterday when Mariana came forward, he set down a bundle of dried rosemary. Sera, his wolf is pulling. It's not subtle anymore. Whatever he felt at the ceremony, it's not fading. It's building. She looked at a bundle of dried sage. That's what I'm afraid of, she said. I know, but I want you to consider something. He turned to face her, and his voice dropped to the level they used when it was just the two of them, below the ambient noise of the market. The oracle said the first alpha who truly sees you. She used those words specifically. We've been through this. I know, but I've been thinking about it differently. He paused. In healer's training, we talk about the difference between looking and seeing. Looking is surface, observation, cataloging, the way you look at a patient to note their symptoms. Seeing is something else. It's recognition, understanding. When you truly see someone, you know them, not just their appearance, their nature. Another pause. Has he seen you? Truly? Does he know you? Sera thought about the archive room, the pen, darker at the center, lighter at the edge. She thought about exactly, said twice in the same tone of quiet recognition. He's close, she said, the same words she'd used before. But not there, and you know the difference. You'd feel it, wouldn't you? If it had happened, if the bond had fully triggered. She thought about what the oracle had described. Burns you alive from the inside out. She thought about the warmth her wolf carried now, the answering pull when he looked at her. It was significant. It was unlike anything she'd felt before. But it wasn't burning. It was the opposite of burning. It was the feeling of something cold that had been cold for a very long time beginning, slowly and carefully, to warm. I'd know, she said quietly. It hasn't happened. Then you still have time. He looked at her steadily. But Sera, I want you to think about something. What if you've been running from the wrong version of the prophecy? She looked at him. The oracle told you what would happen if the bond triggered, he said carefully. She didn't tell you that the bond would definitely trigger. She told you the conditions under which it would be dangerous, which suggests there might be conditions under which it isn't, she said. Exactly. She was quiet for a long moment. Enki, she said finally. She said not a metaphor. Very specifically. I know. He picked up the lavender again. But she also said the first alpha who truly sees you. And here you are, living in the same city as the most powerful alpha in the kingdom, spending every day in his proximity, and you're still standing. He looked at her. That's not nothing. She bought the sage, even though she had no use for it, because her hands needed something to do. She walked back to the lodgings and sat on her bed and thought about conditions. The task force meeting the following morning had a different quality. Sera noticed it when she walked in, something in the atmosphere of the room, the way the other representatives held themselves, a particular alert attention that suggested the investigation had moved. She sat down. Riven was already at the head of the table, with a folder that was thicker than usual. The Alpha King was not in his observer's chair. He arrived 4 minutes after she did, and he brought the particular gravity with him that he always brought, and he sat, and the meeting began. We have a development, Riven said. In addition to the pending Coalfield meeting, We've received new information from the Ceremony Administration Office. An archivist conducting a separate review identified an anomaly in the sign-out register. Specifically, an entry that was recorded twice. The same individual appears in the sign-out at both the main desk and the overflow desk, with a time discrepancy of approximately 22 minutes. Sera listened to this with the fixed attention of a person following an interesting administrative problem. The duplication suggests the individual signed out at the overflow desk, then, for reasons unknown, also appeared at the main sign-out, possibly redirected by staff during the high traffic period after the ceremony's close. Riven set a paper on the table. The individual in question is from a Western pack. The entries are being cross-referenced now, but we expect to have a name by this afternoon. Sera looked at the paper. She had signed out. She had done it correctly, at the overflow desk, which was where she'd been directed when the main desk line was too long. She had not signed out at the main desk, because she'd already signed out. But she had been near the main desk. She had queued briefly, been redirected by a staff member, and walked to the overflow desk. A staff member might have noted her, might have made a partial entry before the redirect. Might have... She looked at Riven's folder. She looked at the paper on the table. She looked at her own hands. This afternoon, he'd said. By this afternoon. She had hours. She did not panic. Panicking was a form of stillness, and she could not afford stillness right now. She went through the rest of the meeting on autopilot. Her mouth said appropriate professional things, her pen made appropriate notes, her face maintained its adequate expression. She was very good at this. She had 8 years of practice operating her external self while her internal self worked on a completely different problem. The problem was this: when the duplication was traced to a name, the name would be hers and she would be in the room. She needed to not be in the room. Not permanently. Not obviously. Just not in the room when that particular piece of information arrived, so she had the space to decide how to respond to it before she was required to respond to it in front of everyone. After the meeting, she found Riven at the door. "The ledger review I started 2 days ago," she said. "The secondary Western Pack records. I'd like to complete it this afternoon. Would it be all right if I worked in the archive room? I can have a report by tomorrow morning." Riven looked at her. He had, she thought, a soldier's instinct for people who were managing something. He'd been watching her with a particular neutrality for 2 days now that suggested he'd noticed things he hadn't yet articulated to himself. "The archive room is available," he said. "I'll note you're working there this afternoon." "Thank you." She went to the archive room. She did not review ledgers. She sat at the long table with an open ledger in front of her, and thought very hard about the only option she hadn't let herself look at directly. Telling him. Not everything, but enough. Enough to stop the investigation, to give herself a reason for her behavior that wasn't guilt, but was also genuinely true. "I was at the ceremony. I left early. I had reasons I'm not able to share. Please release me from this task force and let me go home." He would ask questions. She could deflect questions. She was very good at deflecting questions. But something about the way he looked at her, exactly, twice, in the same quiet tone of recognition, suggested that this particular person might be harder to deflect than most. She sat with this for a long time. Outside, the afternoon moved. The light in the archive room shifted from the pale gold of midday to the slightly warmer, lower light of the 4th hour. She had been sitting at the table for 2 hours without reviewing a single entry. The door opened. She did not need to look up to know who it was. The room changed in the particular way it changed when he entered it. She looked up anyway. He closed the door behind him. He did not have documents. He did not have Riven or an aide. He crossed the room and stopped at the end of the table, not sitting, not formally positioned, simply standing at the table's end with his hands at his sides, looking at her. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Majesty." Quiet. "The duplication in the sign-out register," he said. "Riven has the name." She held very still. "The name," he said, carefully and precisely, "is yours." She looked at him. He looked at her. The archive room was completely silent. "I see," she said. Her voice was steady. It was, in this moment, the greatest achievement of her life. The overflow desk sign-out confirms you left before the ceremony's formal close. His voice was even. The main desk partial entry suggests you were in the east courtyard area, consistent with the last sighting of the masked woman. A pause. And your sign-in time from the fourth ledger, 41 minutes after your pack group, is consistent with someone who changed before arrival. She said nothing. You reviewed that ledger yourself, he said. You noted the late arrivals, including your own, and characterized them as administrative anomalies. She said nothing. You also submitted a cross-reference report that identified 3 preliminary candidates, none of whom were you. A brief pause. It's a very good report, thorough, accurate in all its details about everyone it mentions. She looked at him. He looked at her. Say something, he said. Not a command. Something more direct than a command. A request, from someone who needed the answer not for the investigation, but for a reason he wasn't naming. She looked down at the open ledger in front of her. I had reasons, she said, for leaving early, for not identifying myself. I know, he said. I want to understand them. They're private. Most important reasons are. She looked back up. He was watching her with the expression she'd been trying to categorize for 6 days now. The one that wasn't cataloging, wasn't commanding, wasn't the careful authority of the Alpha King. The one that was something underneath all of those things, something quieter and more complicated. I can't tell you, she said. And then, because it was the only honest sentence she'd said to him, I'm sorry. He was quiet for a moment. The mask, he said. The emerald gown. You attended the ceremony in disguise. She said nothing, which was not denial. And when I found you in the courtyard, he stopped. She watched something move through his face. Not anger, not suspicion. The particular careful quality of a man who is arriving at a conclusion he's been building toward for a long time, and is not entirely prepared for what it means. You knew who I was, he said, and you ran. Yes. Why? She looked at him and thought about saying, because the oracle told me you'd kill me, and thought about how that sentence would land, and thought about Enki's voice in the market. What if you've been running from the wrong version of the prophecy? Because I was afraid, she said. Not of you. She paused. Of what it meant. That you'd found me. That you're wolf. She stopped. She had said too much. She could see from his expression that she'd given him something significant, something that fit into the space he'd been trying to fill. My wolf, he said. I have to go, she said. She stood. She gathered nothing. There was nothing to gather. She'd brought no materials. And she walked toward the door. And he did not stop her, did not speak, did not move. She was at the door when he said, Sera. Her name, not Miss Voss. Her name, in his voice, and it landed differently than it should have. It landed with weight, with specificity, with the particular shape of something that had been waiting to be said. She stopped. Her hand was on the door. I'm not going to force you to tell me anything, he said. That's not what I want. A pause. She heard him breathe. But I want you to know that whatever you're afraid of, whatever reason made you hide and run, and spend 6 days redirecting an investigation that was always going to find you. Another pause. Shorter. I'm not the threat you think I am. She stood at the door and pressed her forehead very briefly against the wood and closed her eyes. You don't know what you are, she thought. That's the problem. She opened the door. I'll submit my formal report tomorrow, she said, in her adequate voice, and then I'm going home. She walked out. She did not go back to the lodgings. She walked, instead, through the late afternoon streets of Valdenmere, past the market stalls, past the lamplighters who were earlier now that the days were shortening, past the river that she could smell but not quite see from here, and she walked until the cold had worked its way through her coat, and her feet ached, and the city around her had settled into its evening sounds. She was angry. Not at him. At the architecture of the whole thing. The prophecy, the ceremony, the summons that had dragged her here, the coincidence of a mask purchased at a market stall, and a man who had been looking for something for 12 years, and had looked in her direction at exactly the wrong moment. At the fact that he'd said, I'm not the threat you think I am, with the specific quiet conviction of someone who meant it completely, and had no idea how wrong they were. She was angry because he was... She stopped walking. She stood on a bridge over a tributary of the main river, her hands on the stone railing, and looked at the dark water below. She was angry because he was kind, not the performance of kindness, not the deliberate graciousness of someone in authority being careful with their power. The actual thing, direct, unpretentious, present. She had seen it in the way he'd said "I'm sorry" about her parents, in the way he'd said, "I'm not going to force you," with no strategy behind it, just honesty. She was angry because it was so much easier to run from a villain. Running from someone who called you by your name, in that voice, and meant nothing threatening by it at all. She gripped the railing. She thought about Enki's question. What if you've been running from the wrong version of the prophecy? She thought about 8 years of gray dresses and flat hair and adequate expressions, and she thought about 6 days of being herself, the actual version of herself, the one who retained census figures and stayed up until midnight completing reports and noticed things from the periphery and stood in alcoves drinking sparkling drinks she didn't want and having someone notice. Not the masked woman, not the emerald gown, her peripheral attention, like someone accustomed to observing without being observed. He'd named it, in front of the whole task force, and it had been the most precisely seen she'd felt in 8 years. She pushed off the railing. She walked back to the lodgings. She was going to write her report. She was going to submit it. She was going to go home. She was not going to think about dark amber eyes or the way her name had sounded in that corridor. She pushed open the lodging's door. Enki was in the common room. He looked at her face and didn't say anything, just held out a cup of tea. She took it. "He knows," she said. Enki nodded. "He knows," she said again, "and he didn't." She stopped. "He didn't what?" She looked at the tea. "He said he wasn't a threat," she said quietly. Enki was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you believe him?" She thought about it with the same precision she brought to ledger discrepancies, stripping it to components, looking for where the numbers balanced. She thought about everything she'd observed in 6 days. A man who read original documents rather than summaries, who said "I'm sorry" without checking whether it landed, who turned a description of peripheral attention into a specific, careful observation rather than a category, who had found her in a corridor and looked at her, just her, and then controlled the look and walked away. "Yes," she said. It was the most frightening thing she'd said all week. Chapter 7. She wrote the report that night. Not the misdirection, not the careful architecture of useful wrongness she'd been constructing for 6 days. The real report. 4 pages, precisely formatted, detailing her attendance at the ceremony under a disguise she'd assembled from a borrowed gown and a market stall mask, her early departure, the reasons she'd concealed her identity from the task force. The reasons. She sat with her pen over that section for a long time. She wrote, "I am the subject of an oracle's mark, documented with Crestmore Pack Elder Doran, and available upon request." The oracle's statement, delivered on the occasion of my 16th birthday, indicated that a mate bond of unusual intensity posed a significant risk to my well-being. I attended the ceremony in disguise, to fulfill the legal requirement of attendance, while minimizing my exposure to the conditions the oracle described. I did not intend to mislead the investigation, but felt I had no choice but to obscure my identity once the task force was convened. I apologize for the inconvenience this has caused, and accept whatever administrative consequence the Crown considers appropriate. She read it back. Significant risk to my well-being was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, standing in for "will burn you alive from the inside out," but she thought the general meaning was clear enough. She sealed the report. She set it on the corner of the desk to be delivered in the morning. Then she lay down on her bed in her clothes and looked at the ceiling and thought about the word "apologize," which she had used in the report and which she was not entirely sure she meant. She was sorry for the inconvenience. She was not particularly sorry for running. She was not sorry for 6 days of careful misdirection that had kept her alive and unseen. She was sorry for the look on his face when he'd said "say something." That was the only apology she felt cleanly. She did not sleep for a long time. She delivered the report to Riven at the 8th hour. He accepted it with the careful neutrality of a man who had been briefed and was managing a reaction. "The Alpha King will review this morning," he said. "He's requested a meeting. This afternoon, at the 3rd hour." She had expected this. "I'll be there," she said. She went back to the lodgings and sat in the common room and drank bitter tea and waited for Enki to appear, which he did at the 9th hour, with the punctuality of someone who had also not slept particularly well. "Report submitted?" he said. "The real one." He sat down. "How much did you put in?" "The oracle's mark, the reasons for the disguise, not." She paused. "Not the specific wording, not what exactly the oracle said would happen, just that there was a risk." That's enough for him to ask questions. "Yes. And when he asks questions..." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I'll answer them honestly." Enki looked at her for a moment. "That's new." "Yes," she said. He poured himself tea. They sat in companionable quiet for a while, the kind of quiet that only exists between people who have been in a crisis together long enough that silence feels like a form of support. "Sera," he said eventually. Whatever happens in that meeting..." He stopped, started again. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, that you believe him, that he's not a threat. If that's true..." He turned his cup. "If the oracle's condition is truly sees you, and if seeing means knowing, really knowing, then the bond triggering isn't a matter of proximity, it's a matter of understanding, which means I've been safe this whole time," she said, very quietly. "Because he's been looking at me and not seeing me, not in the way that counts. Yes. But if I tell him everything, if I explain, then the conditions change," Enki finished. They both sat with that. "If the bond triggers after he truly knows you," Enki said carefully, "and it still burns, you'll have your answer. The prophecy is what it is." He paused. "But if it doesn't..." Then the oracle was describing the danger of the bond without the right conditions, the danger of being half seen, the bond catching fire without a proper container. She thought out loud, slowly, like working through a ledger discrepancy. Like a fire that burns the house down because you lit it in the middle of the floor, not because fire is inherently destructive, but because you need a hearth," Enki said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the patient, steady expression of someone who had been waiting a long time for her to arrive at this conclusion. "I might be completely wrong," she said. "You might be," he agreed. "The oracle might have meant exactly what I've always thought she meant. She might have. And I might walk into that meeting and explain everything, and he might truly see me, and it might kill you," he said, simply. "Yes, that's the risk." She was quiet. "It's always been the risk," she said. "Yes, the difference is that before, you were managing it by ensuring it never happened. And now I'm considering whether a different kind of management might be possible." He nodded. She looked at her tea. "I'm terrified," she said. Just that. Without the adequate voice, without the professional neutrality, the plain fact of it. "I know," he said. "That seems right, actually, given the circumstances." The meeting room was not the amber chamber, and not the library, and not the archive room. It was a smaller room she hadn't been in before, a private sitting room off the main corridor, with 2 chairs by a window that looked onto the same courtyard garden she'd seen from the inner passage on the first day. The fountain was still shut off, the tree was bare now, its branches clean and dark against the pale sky. He was already there when she arrived. He stood when she entered, a courtesy she hadn't expected, and gestured to the chair across from his. She sat, he sat. The room was quiet. He had her report on the table between them, but he didn't open it. He looked at her. "I read it," he said. "I know." "The oracle's mark." He said it carefully, as though handling something he didn't want to misuse. "You've had it since you were 16. "Yes. And the risk it describes. You came to the ceremony anyway, because attendance was legally required." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said, "that you were put in that position." She looked at him. He said it the same way he'd said it about her parents, without checking whether it landed. Just the honest thing, offered simply. Thank you, she said. Can you tell me what it says? The oracle's mark? He paused. You don't have to, but I'd like to understand what you've been managing, if you're willing. She thought about Enki's words. The difference is that before, you were managing it by ensuring it never happened. She looked at the window, the bare tree, the shut-off fountain. The oracle said, she began, and her voice was steady, not the adequate voice, just her actual voice, which was slightly lower than the adequate version and didn't have the professional neutrality in it, that the bond that finds me will be the bond that kills me. That the first alpha who truly sees me will trigger a mate bond so powerful it will burn me alive from the inside out, that my wolf can't hold that much power, that it will consume her trying. Silence. He was very still. She was specific, Sera continued, because she had started, and the particular relief of finally saying the true thing was carrying her forward. That it wasn't a metaphor. She said that explicitly. Sit down, not a metaphor. How old were you? 16. He let out a slow breath. Not theatrically. She would have disliked that. Just the breath of someone absorbing something significant. And so you made yourself invisible, he said. I made myself invisible, she confirmed. For 8 years. For 8 years. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. At the ceremony, when I found you in the courtyard, you ran because you thought. Because you'd looked at me, she said, and I felt your wolf find direction. And I felt, she stopped. What did you feel? She looked at him directly. I felt my wolf answer, she said, for the first time in 8 years. She turned over like something waking up, and I told her to stop, and she stopped, but not the way she used to. She paused. It's been like that ever since. Every time I'm near you, she keeps trying to surface. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the methodical cataloging, not the careful authority. Something open and attentive, as though the usual architecture of his face had set down its load for a moment. My wolf, he said, carefully, has been silent on the subject of mates for 12 years, since I ascended. Every ceremony, every delegation, every formal gathering. Nothing. He paused. At the ceremony 3 weeks ago, in the space of 2 seconds, across a crowded hall, he found direction. He said there and nothing else, and he hasn't stopped saying it since. She held very still. I've been careful, he said. I'm a methodical man. I don't act on things I can't categorize. But I want you to know, everything I've done since that night, the task force, the ledgers, asking you to stay. He paused. It hasn't been an investigation. What has it been? He looked at her. I think you know, he said. She did know. She had known since the archive room, since darker at the center, lighter at the edge, since exactly, twice. I'm frightened, she said. The plain fact, again. I don't know what happens if you truly see me. If the bond triggers fully. I've been careful for 8 years not to find out. I know. The oracle was very specific. I know that too. So I need you to understand. She stopped, started again. I'm not running anymore. I'm done running, I think, but I need you to understand that I'm sitting here terrified, and it's not of you, and I need a moment before. Take all the time you need, he said. Simple, immediate, no impatience in it. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and there was the expression again, the one she'd been trying to categorize, not the compass needle finding direction, not the methodical survey, the look of someone who had found the thing they were looking for, and was choosing, very deliberately, to hold still, so as not to startle it. What if, she said slowly, thinking through it as she spoke, the way she'd thought through it in her room last night, the way she'd talked through it with Enki this morning. What if the oracle's condition is more specific than I've been treating it? He waited. He was very good at waiting. She said, truly sees you, Sera said, and I've been treating that as visual recognition, physical identification, the moment the mask comes off. She looked at her hands. But truly seeing someone isn't the same as knowing what their face looks like. No, he said. It isn't. You've been cataloging me for 6 days, she said. My eyes, my habits, The way I construct a cross-reference. What time I stay up until to complete a report. She looked up. But that's still the surface. You know what I do, not... She paused. Not why, he said. Not why, she agreed. The room was very quiet. Outside, the courtyard was still and pale. The bare tree, the shut-off fountain. Then tell me why, he said. Not the Alpha King's voice, just his voice. Not for the investigation, not for the record. Just, tell me. Who you are. Why you made yourself invisible. What it's cost you. A pause. Tell me the things a person would need to know to truly see you. And we'll find out together what that means. She stared at him. It was, she thought, the most extraordinary thing anyone had ever said to her. Not because it was grand or dramatic. It wasn't either of those things. Because it was so precisely accurate to what she needed, and so straightforwardly offered, without strategy, without an angle, without anything but the simple willingness to sit across from her and receive whatever she gave him. She thought about 16, and the Oracle's back office, and going home and sitting on the edge of her bed. She thought about gray dresses and flat hair, and 8 years of making herself forgettable. She thought about the archive room, and the pen, and the warmth her wolf carried now that she couldn't put out. She thought about the bond that kills you, and the hearth, and the difference between fire in the middle of the floor and fire where it's supposed to be. She took a breath. I was born in Whitfin, she said, Eastern Territory. My parents were both wolves. My father was a low-rank pack member. My mother was an herbalist. Neither of them was particularly powerful, which is why nobody understood the Oracle's prophecy. Where would I encounter a bond powerful enough to be dangerous? We were nobody. She paused. They died when I was 15. A fever, both of them, within 2 weeks of each other. I moved to Crestmore to my aunt's pack, and a year later I went to the Oracle because I was having... My wolf was restless, uncomfortable, and I didn't know what that meant, and I wanted an answer. And she gave you one. She gave me one, Sera agreed. Not the one I was expecting. She looked at the window. I decided the next morning to make myself invisible, she said. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because being afraid of something you can't prevent seemed worse than preventing it. I found the gray dresses, and the flat hair, and the adequate expression, and I practiced until they felt like mine. She paused. And they worked. 8 years, they worked. No Alpha looked at me twice. No bond stirred. My wolf went quiet, and I thought I'd managed it. Found the solution to an unsolvable problem. And then the summons came, he said. And then the summons came. She looked back at him. You want to know what it's cost me, she said. If you're willing. Everything that isn't work, she said simply. I'm very good at work. I find it genuinely satisfying. The records, the numbers, the patterns that resolve. I built a small, clean life around the things I can do well without risk. She paused. But I haven't, she stopped. I haven't let anyone in. My aunt tries. Enki, in 6 days, has gotten closer than anyone in years. She looked at her hands again. I haven't allowed myself to want things. For 8 years. Because wanting things requires being visible, and being visible is dangerous, and... She stopped. He said nothing. He just waited. I was so lonely, she said. The words came out quietly, and she felt their truth in the way you feel something that has been held tightly for a very long time. Not relief exactly, but the strange ache of loosened pressure. For 8 years, she said, I made myself invisible, and I was very good at it. And I was so lonely, I'd sometimes sit in the back office with my ledgers and wonder if I'd made the right choice, whether the alternative was better than this. She looked up. It never seemed like it. The Oracle was very clear, and I don't have a wolf strong enough to. She stopped again. He leaned forward slightly, not reaching, not crowding, just closing the distance by a fraction, the way you lean towards something you're listening to very carefully. Sera, he said. She looked at him. I need to tell you something, he said. And I need you to hear it as information, not as pressure. You can do whatever you want with it. She nodded. My wolf's bond, the recognition at the ceremony, what I've felt in this room, in the archive room, in every corridor for 6 days. It doesn't feel like burning, he said. It feels like... He paused, and she watched him search for the word with the deliberateness of a man who chose words carefully. Completion, like something that's been structurally missing finding its place. He looked at her. I don't know what that means for your prophecy. I don't know if my experience of it tells us anything about yours, but I want you to have that information. She held very still. Completion. Her wolf, in her chest, went utterly quiet. Not the dormant quiet of 8 years of suppression, but the listening quiet of something paying profound attention. And underneath it, in the place where the bond pulled, the warmth that had been building since the ceremony, since the courtyard, since 2 seconds of contact over a pen. Not burning, not even close to burning. Something warm and even and deep, like a fire that had found its hearth and knew exactly where it was supposed to be. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. He watched her do it. What are you feeling? He asked. Warm, she said, very quietly. Just warm. He said nothing. Not burning, she said. No, he said, not burning. They sat with that for a moment. The oracle, she began. Said the bond that finds you will kill you, he finished. Yes, and I'm not dismissing that. I'm not telling you it can't be true, but I want to ask you something. She waited. Has it killed you? He said. She looked at him. 6 days, he said. 6 days of proximity. The ceremony, the courtyard, the archive room. My wolf pulling toward you every time I'm near you. Your wolf responding. He paused. Has anything burned? She thought about it. Not as an intellectual exercise. She had been thinking about it intellectually for 6 days. As an actual physical inventory. Her wolf. The warmth. The way the bond pulled, even now, across the 2 feet of space between their chairs. No, she said. Then the oracle's condition hasn't been met, he said. Whatever truly sees you means we haven't crossed it yet. And maybe, he stopped. Maybe the question isn't whether the bond kills you. Maybe the question isn't whether the bond kills you. Whether we build it slowly enough, carefully enough, with enough. Hearth, she said. He looked at her. I don't know what that means. Something Enki said. She almost smiled. He said fire burns the house down when you light it in the middle of the floor, but that's not the fire's fault. He was quiet for a moment. Then, he's a very good healer's assistant. He's a very good person, she said. He's also been helping me deceive your investigation for 6 days, and I think you should probably forgive him for that. He looked at her steadily. I'll consider it. Something shifted between them. Not dramatic, not sudden. The slow settling of something that had been held at tension finding a more natural position. She looked at the window, the bare tree, the still courtyard. I don't know what to do, she said. With any of this, I've been invisible for 8 years and I don't have a framework for... Neither do I, he said. I've been king for 12 years, and I've been alone for 12 years, and I'm genuinely very good at running a kingdom, and very bad at this. A pause. Whatever this is. We could be bad at it together, she said. She wasn't sure where the sentence came from. It came out before she'd decided to say it, which was unusual for her. He looked at her. Something in his expression did the thing she'd been watching for 6 days. The methodical cataloging setting down its work. The careful authority stepping back. The thing underneath showing itself fully for the first time. Yes, he said. Just that. Yes. Her wolf, in her chest, turned over once, slow and warm and certain, and did not go back to sleep. She stayed another hour. Not for the investigation, not for the task force. They talked, not strategically, not procedurally. He told her about the 12 years, what they'd cost him, the particular loneliness of authority that was indistinguishable from isolation. She told him about Crestmore, the ledgers, the small clean life she'd built out of limitation. He told her about the 3rd rule, never trust a feeling you can't explain. I've been violating it since the ceremony, he said. How does that feel? She asked. Correct, he said, after a moment. Which is more alarming than the violation. She almost laughed. It surprised her, the almost laugh, the way it surfaced without warning. like something that hadn't had room to exist before and was testing whether it fit. It fit. She walked back to the lodgings in the early evening, in the cold that smelled like autumn and bread and wood smoke, and she looked at her hands in the lamplight and ran a careful inventory. Wolf, warm, settled, present, not burning. Chest, the pull of the bond, quiet and even. Not burning. Her, terrified, uncertain, visible in a way she hadn't been in 8 years, and somehow, underneath all of it, something she didn't quite have a word for. Wanting things, she thought, for the first time in 8 years. She was visible. She was not burning. She pushed open the lodging's door. Enki looked up from the common room table. He looked at her face. "Well?" he said. She sat down across from him. "I told him everything," she said. "And?" She thought about completion. She thought about yes. She thought about the bare tree in the courtyard, and the shut-off fountain, and the particular quiet of a room where two people were finally saying the true thing. "Not burning," she said. Enki exhaled slowly. The particular exhale of someone who has been holding something for a long time on another person's behalf. "Not burning," he repeated. "Not even close," she said. He reached across the table and poured her tea. Hot, slightly too bitter, exactly right. She wrapped her hands around the cup. Outside, Valdenmere moved through its evening, and somewhere in the palace, the Alpha King was probably doing something methodical and careful, and thinking about completion and yes, and the difference between fire in the wrong place and fire where it belonged. And for the first time in 8 years, Sera let herself think about the future. Not with dread, with something that felt, cautiously, tentatively, with appropriate respect for how frightening it was. Like hope. Chapter 8. She went back to Crestmore, not running this time, not with a travel case packed at midnight and a plan assembled from desperation. She went with a formal release from the task force, submitted by Riven, signed by the Crown, citing substantial contribution and satisfactory conclusion of primary investigative duties, and a travel arrangement that included an actual seat in an actual carriage, rather than the back of a borrowed cart. She went with Enki, who was also formally released, and who spent most of the first day of travel eating an apple and reading a medical text, and not asking her anything, which was exactly what she needed. And she went with something she hadn't carried on the journey to Valdenmere, a letter. It was in her coat pocket. She was aware of it the way you're aware of something that has weight beyond its physical dimensions. He had given it to her the morning she left, in the palace courtyard, in the early cold before the city had fully woken. He'd come himself rather than sending it through Riven, which she noted. He'd handed it to her without ceremony. "Read it when you're ready," he said, "not before." She hadn't read it. She wasn't ready. She wasn't sure what ready meant in the context of a letter from the Alpha King that she had agreed to receive and could not yet open, but she was certain she didn't feel it yet, and she was done performing feelings she didn't have. She put her hand over her coat pocket and felt the letter's rectangular weight through the fabric, and looked at the pine trees moving past the carriage window, and thought about hearths. Crestmore looked the same. Of course it did. She had been gone for 11 days. Towns did not substantially reorganize themselves in 11 days. The square was the same square. The river made the same sound. The pine trees were perhaps marginally more bare than when she'd left, their needles thinned by the advancing autumn. Her Aunt Bryn met her at the pack boundary, a small, compact woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and the particular expression of someone who had been worried and was now converting that worry into practical action. "You look tired," Bryn said, by way of greeting. "I'm fine," Sera said. "You look like you haven't slept properly in 11 days. 8 days, the first 3 were fine." Bryn looked at her for a moment. Then she took Sera's travel case out of her hands and started walking. "I've made soup. Come and eat something." Sera followed her. Enki had continued to Dusk Hollow, his own pack, his own return. He'd squeezed her arm at the crossroads junction and said, "Write to me." And she'd said, "I will," and meant it, which was new. She was adding people to the small list of those she allowed close, and it felt less dangerous than it used to. Progress, possibly. She went back to work the next morning. The third cabinet from the left needed reorganizing. She'd been gone 11 days, and the temporary record keeper Elder Doran had appointed had a different filing philosophy. Not wrong exactly, just different in the way that made Sera's hands itch. She spent the morning putting things back where they belonged, which was grounding and satisfying, and required almost no thought. Almost. The letter was on the corner of her desk. She'd moved it there from her coat pocket when she arrived. She'd looked at it while she reorganized the third cabinet. She'd made tea, drunk half of it, reorganized the second cabinet as a buffer activity, and come back to find the letter still there, rectangular and patient. "Read it when you're ready." She sat down at her desk. She picked it up. She turned it over. The seal on the back was plain wax, dark red, pressed with a simple signet. Not the crown seal. Personal. She opened it. "Sera, I'm aware this may be an unusual letter to receive. I've written it 4 times. This is the version that doesn't have any of the things I decided not to say. I want to be clear about something, in writing, in daylight, without the particular gravity of a palace sitting room or the weight of an investigation between us. I'm not asking you for anything. Whatever you decide about the bond, about the oracle's mark, about what the last 11 days have meant, that's yours to decide, at whatever pace you need, and I won't push. What I want you to have is information, as accurately as I can give it. My wolf has been clear since the ceremony. Since the courtyard, since the archive room, since the sitting room where you told me about 16 and gray dresses and 8 years of making yourself forgettable. He's been clear every day since, and he grows more clear, not less, which I'm told is what happens when the bond is real. I have not told you that to apply pressure. I've told you because you've spent 8 years making decisions based on incomplete information. Specifically, information that told you this bond was dangerous without telling you anything about the nature of the danger, or whether the danger was fixed or conditional. You made the only reasonable choice you could with what you had. I want you to make your next choice with more. What I know, the bond, as I experience it, is not violent. It doesn't pull or demand. I said completion before, and I meant it, but I want to be more specific. It feels like the thing that was missing was not something I lacked, but something I was waiting for. There's a difference. The first is a wound. The second is just time. I don't know what it feels like on your end. You said warm. I believed you, and I'm holding that. I'd like to know you better. I'd like to do it carefully, at whatever speed doesn't frighten you. I'd like to write to you, if you're willing, and hear about the ledgers and the third cabinet from the left, and what Crestmore looks like in autumn. I'd like to tell you about the kingdom, the things that are hard about it, and the things I've managed to make work, because I don't tell those things to anyone, and I find I'd like to. You said you were lonely for 8 years. I want you to know that I understand that from a direction you might not expect. Read this when you're ready. There's no deadline. Calum. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the desk beside the reorganized files and looked at the window. Crestmore in autumn. The pine trees, the river, the flat gray sky that she'd always found comfortable, the square, the bakery, the third cabinet from the left. I'd like to know you better. She folded the letter carefully, precisely, along its original crease lines. She put it in the drawer of her desk, not filed, not categorized, just there, in the drawer, accessible. Then she picked up her pen and pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her and began to write. The Oracle of Crestmore was not the same Oracle who had delivered the prophecy at 16. That Oracle, the one with the dry voice and the bored expression, and the specific precision about not a metaphor, had died 4 years ago, peacefully, in her sleep, which Sera had always thought was a quietly ironic ending for someone whose life's work was predicting things. Replaced by a younger woman named Oren, who was 32 and had the alert, precise quality of someone still taking her work very seriously. Sera made an appointment. She had never gone back to an oracle about the same prophecy. It had always seemed counterproductive. The oracle said what the oracle said, and arguing with it or seeking clarification had always struck her as the behavior of someone who hadn't understood the assignment. But she was no longer the 16-year-old who had gone home and sat on the edge of her bed and accepted the assignment without question. She was 24, and she had spent 11 days in a palace being herself, actually herself, not the adequate version, and she had felt a bond building in her chest that was warm and even, and showed absolutely no signs of burning, and she wanted, for the first time since she was 16, to ask a different question. Oren's office was at the edge of the Pack territory, in a small stone house that had been the Oracle's home for 3 generations. It smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, and something indefinitely older that Sera associated specifically with this building. Oren opened the door before she knocked. "Sera Voss," she said, "I wondered when you'd come." "You knew I was coming?" "Not specifically, but something has been shifting in your line for several weeks. Come in." She was offered tea, also slightly too bitter. Sera was beginning to think this was an occupational affectation among mystical practitioners, and a chair by the fire, and Oren sat across from her with the alert, precise attention of someone who read subsurface things for a living. "The old prophecy," Sera said. "I know it," Oren said. "It's in the records. I've read every oracle record from this pack back 40 years. I want to ask about the specific wording. The first alpha who truly sees you." Oren's expression didn't change. "What about it?" "What does truly sees mean, in oracle language?" Sera asked. "Specifically, not in the interpretation I've been using, visual identification, physical recognition, in the actual language." Oren was quiet for a moment. "Oracle language is compressed," she said. "A prophecy is. It's an attempt to render something multidimensional in a few words. The words are chosen to be accurate, but they're not always chosen to be complete." She paused. "What was your working interpretation?" "That any alpha who recognized my face, who identified me as a potential mate, would trigger the bond. And what's happened to suggest that interpretation might be incomplete?" Sera thought about the ceremony. "The courtyard. 11 days in Valdenmere. The Alpha King has been looking at me for 11 days, she said. His wolf recognized direction at the ceremony. We've spent significant time in proximity. The bond has been building on both sides. She looked at Oren steadily. "I'm still here." Oren was quiet. "Tell me what the bond feels like," she said. "Warm," Sera said, immediately. "Even, not urgent, not pulling or demanding, like something settling into its correct position." "And your wolf?" "Present, more present than she's been in 8 years. She turns toward him when we're near each other, but she's not distressed." Sera paused. "She's never been distressed. Since the beginning, I'd say she's been satisfied in a way she hasn't been since before the prophecy." Oren looked at the fire for a moment. "The original oracle," she said carefully, "was describing a bond triggered in a state of incompleteness. One-sided, or sudden, or formed between strangers with no foundation." She paused. "The prophetic danger in your line isn't the bond itself. It's what the bond does when it ignites in conditions that can't contain it." She looked at Sera. "Truly seeing someone isn't recognition. It's not identification. It's what happens when you know someone's nature well enough to hold it, without it becoming something else." Sera was very still. "The danger," Oren continued, "was never the alpha who sees your face. The danger was always the alpha who sees you. Your full self, the actual you, not the constructed version, before the conditions exist to contain what that ignites." She paused. "If those conditions have been built first, slowly, carefully, with full knowledge on both sides, then the bond has a container," Sera said. "Then the fire has a hearth," Oren said. Sera stared at her. "Enki figured that out," she said. "He's a healer's assistant. He sounds like a perceptive one. He reorganized someone's herb cabinet. They haven't forgiven him." Oren's mouth curved slightly. "The prophecy is not a sentence," she said. "It was a warning, about conditions. The conditions you've been so careful to avoid. A bond triggered without foundation, without time, without full knowledge. Those are genuinely dangerous for you. But what you're describing," she paused, "what you're describing doesn't sound like those conditions." "It doesn't," Sera said. "The original oracle would say," Oren said carefully. "It is not what I saw." Sera breathed. She breathed again. "The bond," she said. "If it completes, fully, do you see anything?" Oren was quiet for a long moment. The fire moved. The room smelled of herbs and wood smoke and old certainties being revised. Warmth, Oren said. I see warmth. She walked home through the pine trees. The air was cold and smelled of autumn and the river, and the sky above the tree line was the flat, comfortable gray she'd always found grounding, and she walked with her hands in her pockets, and her steps measured, and her wolf turned toward something distant and warm and patient. She thought about 16 and the back office, and not a metaphor, child. She thought about 11 days and a letter and completion, and yes, she thought about the drawer in her desk where the letter sat accessible and unarchived. She thought about the sheet of paper she'd started writing on this morning and set aside because she hadn't known what to say yet. She thought she might know now. Back at her desk, she picked up the pen. She wrote, Calum, I went to see the oracle today. Not the same one. She died 4 years ago, which seems fitting for reasons I can't fully articulate. The new one is younger and reads subsurface things with the precision of someone who takes her work seriously. I appreciated that about her. She told me the prophecy was a warning about conditions, not a sentence about outcome. She used the word container. I've been thinking about that word since I walked home through the pine trees. Crestmore in autumn is gray and quiet, and smells of wood smoke and the river. The pine trees have thinned a little. The square is the same. The third cabinet from the left took most of the morning to reorganize, which is its own kind of satisfaction. I'd like to tell you about the kingdom, you said. I'd like to hear it. I'm not frightened right now. I want to note that, because I've been frightened consistently for 8 years, and not being frightened feels significant enough to mark. I'm warm. Write back when you're ready. There's no deadline. Sera. She folded it, sealed it, and set it on the corner of her desk to go with the morning post. Then she made tea, settled into her chair, and opened the quarterly census records. The numbers were orderly and complete, and resolved in all the right places. She worked until the light faded, and for the first time in 8 years, she looked up when she was done and noticed the quality of the evening. The particular blue of late autumn dusk through the small window, the smell of someone's wood smoke from across the square, the river's patient sound, and found it beautiful. She had been in this office for 8 years, and she had never found it beautiful before. She turned off her lamp. She went home. Her wolf, warm and present, and entirely uninterested in going back to sleep, walked with her. His reply arrived in 4 days. She recognized the handwriting on the outside of the envelope before she registered that she was recognizing it, which was information about the state of things. She opened it at her desk, in the morning, with her tea. It was longer than her letter. He wrote the way he spoke, precise and direct, without performance, choosing words with the care of someone who meant them specifically. He wrote about the kingdom, a trade dispute in the Eastern Territories, a flooding problem in the South that required infrastructure planning, a meeting with the Northern Pack elders that had gone better than expected. He wrote about the council chamber in the early morning, which he described as the only time the palace felt like his rather than the crown's. He wrote about Riven, who had made a dry comment about the task force's conclusion that Calum had written down verbatim because it was too good not to. He said, "In 12 years, this is the first investigation that found exactly what it was looking for, by looking in the wrong direction the entire time." I told him that was unfair. He said, "It was a compliment, Your Majesty. I'm still not certain it was." She almost laughed. The actual laugh this time, not the almost. Brief, quiet, surprised out of her. She sat in the back office of the Crestmore Pack Council building, with her tea and a letter from the Alpha King, and the quarterly census records waiting on the corner of her desk. And she laughed at something, and it felt like a door opening in a room that had been closed for a very long time. At the end of the letter he'd written, "You said you're not frightened right now. I want you to know that when you are, and you might be, again because this is frightening, that's allowed. I'm building a hearth, not a bonfire. It takes time to do it right. Calum." She read that paragraph 3 times. Then she put the letter in the drawer beside the first one. She picked up her pen. She wrote back. Chapter 9. The letters became a rhythm. Not daily. She was a record keeper and he was a king, and they both had the kind of work that expanded to fill available time without apology. But regular, consistent. Every 4 to 5 days, give or take travel time, an envelope arrived on the corner of her desk, and 4 to 5 days after that, one left it. She learned things. She learned that he woke early, before the palace staff, before Riven, before the city, and spent the first hour of the morning in the council chamber alone, with documents and tea he made himself, because he had, at some point in the last 12 years, decided that asking someone else to make his morning tea felt like an imposition too far. She found this disproportionately endearing and did not tell him so for 2 letters, then told him on the 3rd. He wrote back, "I've been told it's eccentric. I prefer efficient. The tea is adequate." She had smiled at adequate and felt the word reorganize itself in her vocabulary, from the expression she wore to hide herself to something shared, a small private joke across 300 miles. She learned that he had one friend, not Riven, who was his general and loyal and genuinely trusted, but someone different, a man named Dav, who had grown up 2 streets from the palace and had become, through some combination of circumstance and stubbornness, the one person who had known Calum before he was the crown and continued to treat him accordingly. Dav ran a cartography business. He sent Calum maps he hadn't asked for with annotations in the margins that were sometimes geographic and sometimes just commentary. "He sent me a map of the Southern Territory last week," Calum wrote, with a note in the margin at the flooding region that said, "This is what happens when you don't listen to cartographers." He's not wrong. I've told him he's not wrong. He's added it to a list. She wrote back about Enki, who was corresponding with her from Duskalo and had apparently reorganized a second cabinet without permission. She wrote about the pack council meeting she'd sat through that had concerned a boundary dispute over 3 acres of forest that nobody actually wanted, but everybody felt strongly about on principle. She wrote about the river in the early morning when the frost came, and it steamed slightly, which she'd never paid attention to before, and now found she looked for. "I've been looking for things," she wrote, in the 6th letter. "That's new. For 8 years I looked at things when I needed to for work, and otherwise kept my eyes down. Now I keep catching details, the way the frost comes in from the east first, the particular sound the pine trees make in wind versus rain, which bakery in the square does the better morning bread. I don't know if it's you specifically, or the general effect of being less, of taking up more space, but I notice it." His reply, 4 days later, was a single additional line at the end of a longer letter about the trade dispute. "You're allowed to take up space. All of it. As much as you want." She had read that line 6 times. Bryn noticed. Of course she noticed. Bryn was 53 years old and had spent 3 decades watching people, which she'd always considered her primary occupation regardless of what her census entry said about it. She came to the back office on a Thursday morning with no particular excuse, set a bowl of soup on the corner of Sera's desk next to the census rolls, and sat in the chair across from her. "You're different," she said. Sera didn't look up from the roll she was reviewing. "Good morning, Aunt Bryn. You're smiling at things." People smile. You don't, usually. Or you do, but it's the polite one, the one that means I'm indicating warmth appropriately. Bryn settled into the chair. "This is a different smile. The one you're doing right now, with the census roll." Sera became aware that she had, in fact, been smiling at a census roll. "The numbers resolved correctly," she said. Bryn looked at the corner of the desk, where an envelope sat. She had the perception of someone who had learned to notice things that were being deliberately not noticed. "That's the 3rd one this week. Letters. I correspond with several people. You corresponded with approximately no people before Valdenmere. Now you correspond with several." Bryn's tone was not accusatory. It was the tone of someone cataloging information with genuine warmth. "Enki?" "Yes. And?" Sera put down her pen. She looked at her aunt. Bryn had the patient expression of someone who was not going anywhere, and found no discomfort in silence. "The Alpha King," Sera said. Bryn was very still for a moment. Then, Calum Dravane. "Yes, the Alpha King. You said that already. I'm processing." Bryn looked at the envelope, looked at Sera, the task force. "We corresponded during the task force, and since," Sera picked up her pen, then set it back down. He knows about the oracle's mark. He knows everything. I told him in the palace, and he— She paused. He built a hearth. Bryn looked at her for a moment. That's a metaphor. Yes. Is it a good one? Yes. Bryn was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Sera looked up to check whether she'd fallen asleep in the chair, which she hadn't. She was looking at Sera with an expression that had gone from cataloging to something much softer, the particular expression of someone watching a thing they've been worried about for a long time beginning, carefully, to be all right. Your mother, Bryn said, would have liked him, from what you've described. She liked people who meant what they said. Sera looked at the window. I know, she said quietly. She would have been cross about the 8 years, Bryn added, with the gentleness of someone who could say hard, true things because they came from love. She wouldn't have liked watching you make yourself small. I know that too. But she would have understood it, Bryn said. And she would have been very glad about the not burning part. Sera almost laughed, the actual laugh, surprised out of her. She would have. Bryn stood, gestured at the soup. Eat that before it's cold, and, Sera. The oracle's mark says truly sees you. Does he? Sera thought about the sitting room, the bare tree. Tell me the things a person would need to know to truly see you. She thought about 6 letters, 4 days apart, each one adding something. Not strategically, not impressively, just honestly. The morning tea, Dav's maps, completion, yes. Almost, she said. I think. We're building something. We haven't finished yet. Bryn nodded. Then keep building. She left. Sera looked at the soup. She looked at the envelope on the corner of her desk. She ate the soup. It was good. It was always good. Her aunt cooked the way she did everything, with straightforward and unsentimental competence, and then she opened the envelope. The 7th letter was longer than the others. He wrote about the kingdom with more candor than before, things he hadn't said in the earlier letters, when they were still finding the register. The weight of the ascension at 22, which had been necessary and right and had cost him things he hadn't understood he was giving up. The way the crown created a perimeter around him that was made of respect and authority, and was, functionally, a kind of isolation. The way he had learned to be alone in rooms full of people, and had gotten so good at it that solitude and leadership had become, for 12 years, indistinguishable. Dave told me last year, he wrote, that I had become very good at being the king, and had not yet figured out how to also be a person. He said it in the margins of a map of the capital, next to the palace, with an arrow pointing at the building. I kept the map. I think about it more than I'd like to admit. I'm telling you this because you told me about the gray dresses, and fair exchange seemed right. She read that paragraph twice and thought about parallel things. 2 people building walls from different materials for different reasons, ending up in the same category of alone. She wrote back the same day, which was unusual. I think you and I might have been solving the same problem from opposite directions. You had too much visibility and found a way to be unseen inside it. I had too much at stake in being seen and found a way to be invisible without it. Both of us ended up in the same place. She paused. I find that interesting. I also find that I'm tired of the place we both ended up in, and I'd rather be somewhere else. I suspect you feel the same. The hearth, she wrote. I think we're building it well. I think the walls are going up right. She sent it the next morning. The reply arrived 3 days later instead of 4, which she noted. But what arrived with it was not only a letter. There was a second envelope, smaller, with different handwriting, neat and angular and unfamiliar, addressed to her. She opened it. Inside was a map. A hand-drawn map of Crestmore and the surrounding territory, detailed and accurate, with margin annotations in the angular handwriting. Western boundary. Needs better drainage according to the soil composition. See notation at River Fork. The pine forest to the north is structurally interesting. Unusual density for this elevation. The square has good proportions. Whoever laid it out knew what they were doing. And at the bottom, in smaller writing, he talks about this place more than he realizes. I thought you should see it how a cartographer sees it. Dav. She sat at her desk with a map of her own town, annotated by a man she'd never met, sent because another man had apparently talked about her often enough that his one friend had drawn her a map. She put it in the drawer with the letters. She would need a bigger drawer soon. Winter came to Crestmore. Not dramatically, no single morning of transformation. Gradually, the gray sky deepened, the frost came earlier and stayed longer. The pine trees held their color while everything else let go. The river didn't freeze, it was too fast, but its edges went glassy in the mornings, and the steam she'd started noticing came earlier and lasted longer. She wrote to him about the river. He wrote back about the palace in winter, which he described as magnificent and cold, and requiring approximately 4 times as many fires as seemed reasonable. "The council chamber is the warmest room in the building," he wrote. "I've started suspecting this was architectural policy rather than accident. Keep the decision-making spaces warm enough to function, let everything else be bracing. It works, mostly. Ryven wears a second coat indoors from the first of winter to the last, which he pretends not to do." She laughed at that. She was laughing more. She noticed it the way she'd noticed the river and the frost, an anomaly that, now that she'd identified it, kept presenting itself as evidence. The problem arrived with the snow. Not a disaster. Not even exactly a problem at first. Just a letter with a different weight to it. 8th in the sequence, arriving on a morning when the first real snow was coming down outside the window, light and unhurried. "Sera, there's something I need to tell you, and I want to tell you in a letter rather than a formal communication, because formal communications require language I'd rather not use for this. There's a council faction, 4 of the 7 senior advisors. They've been monitoring the correspondence, not reading it. I want to be clear. I have people I trust, and the letters themselves are private, but tracking the pattern of it. Frequency, origin, duration. They know correspondence with Crestmore has been consistent since the task force concluded. They've drawn conclusions. The formal position, delivered to me by the council eldest this morning, is that an alpha king who has not formed a mate bond after 12 years of rule is creating a succession vulnerability, and that any developing bond should be formalized through proper channels, meaning a formal mating ceremony, declared publicly, with the political weight of the crown behind it. They want me to bring you to Valdenmere. I told them I would consider it. I want to be very clear. I didn't say yes. I didn't commit. I told them I would consider it, which is true. I will consider it. But the consideration I am conducting right now is primarily about what you want, not about what the council has decided is politically necessary. I'm asking, not telling. What do you want? Calum. She read the letter twice. Then she set it down and looked at the snow. The council wanted a formal mating ceremony, publicly declared, with the political weight of the crown. She thought about what that meant. Not as an abstract concept. She knew what it meant as an abstract concept. She maintained kingdom records. She thought about what it meant specifically. For a 24-year-old record keeper from a small western pack, who had spent 8 years making herself invisible, and had only recently, tentatively, carefully begun to take up space. She thought about standing somewhere public and being seen, genuinely, fully, permanently seen, by an entire kingdom. She thought about the oracle's warning. Truly sees you. She thought about the hearth they were building, the letters, the map from Dav, the way she had started laughing at things. She thought about whether the hearth was finished. She thought about whether she needed it to be finished before she found out. She wrote back the same day. Calum, I want to ask you a question before I answer yours. The bond, as you experience it now, is it still building, or has it settled? I'm asking because on my end, it's still building. Warm and consistent and present and still, growing. Slowly, but still moving. I want to know where you are, because where I am is, I think the hearth is almost done. I think we've built most of it right. I think there's one thing left that we haven't done. We've written to each other for 2 months. You know about the gray dresses and the 8 years and the oracle's back office. I know about the morning tea and Dav's maps and the council chamber being the warmest room. You told me about being alone in rooms full of people. I told you about wanting things and not allowing myself to. But we haven't been in the same room since the sitting room in the palace. I want to be in the same room again, not for the council's reasons, For mine. I want to know what the bond does when we're together, with all of this built between us, with the walls up and the hearth ready. I want to know if it still doesn't burn. I want to come to Valdenmere. Not for a formal mating ceremony. Not yet. Just to see. Tell me when. Sera. She sealed it. She put it in the morning post. She looked out the window at the snow, coming down light and unhurried, covering the square in white. Her wolf was warm. The hearth was almost done. She was ready to find out. His reply came in 2 days, the fastest yet. 3 days from now. I'll send the carriage. Calum, P.S. Dav wants to know if you liked the map. He's asked twice. I've told him I haven't heard, which is technically true. You can resolve this at your own discretion. She wrote a separate note directly to Dav, care of the palace, which said, "The map was excellent. The drainage observation at the river fork is correct, and has been a pack council dispute for 4 years. Thank you. Sera Voss, Crestmore." Then she went to find Elder Doran to request a week's leave. He looked at her across his desk with the expression he'd worn when the original royal summons arrived, something between alarm and apology. "Sera," he said. "Are you—" "I'm not running," she said. "I'm going toward something." He looked at her for a long moment. "Good," he said. She packed her travel case. Not the emerald gown. She left that in her wardrobe. Not the mask. She packed gray dresses and practical clothes, and her warmest coat, and the kind of things you bring when you intend to be exactly yourself. She also, at the last moment, put in the letter from Dav. She didn't know why, it seemed right. The carriage arrived on the 3rd morning, sleek and dark, and bearing the crown's emblem, which caused a certain amount of attention in the Crestmore Square that she chose not to notice. Bryn came to see her off. "Come back," she said. "I will," Sera said. "Come back changed," Bryn said, "in whatever direction is true." Sera hugged her. She didn't always. She had been working on it, and got into the carriage. The snow had stopped. The square was white and still, the pine trees holding their snow, the river making its patient sound just out of sight. Crestmore in winter. She looked at it through the carriage window as it pulled away. She was going toward something. She was warm, and present, and entirely herself, and the hearth was almost ready, and she was ready to find out what almost meant when you got there. Chapter 10. Valdenmere in winter was a different city. She hadn't seen it like this. The ceremony had been autumn, sharp and golden. Now it was deep winter, and the city wore it differently. The cobblestones dusted white, the market stalls hung with lanterns against the early dark, the buildings solid and warm-windowed in the gray afternoon light. The river she could glimpse between buildings was dark and fast, no ice at its edges here. The city ran too warm for that, too many fires, too many people. She arrived at the 4th hour, when the light was already thinking about leaving. Riven met her at the palace gate. She had been slightly afraid it would be Riven, formal, procedural, the official receiving of a guest, which would have set a register she didn't want. But Riven, it turned out, had evolved in 2 months. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had watched his Alpha King write letters every 4 days, and make his own morning tea, and stand at windows slightly more than usual, and had drawn his own conclusions, and had decided those conclusions made him not quite warmly disposed. He was not a warm man, but something adjacent to it. "Miss Voss," he said, "welcome back." "General Riven," she said. "Thank you." He led her through the gate and across the courtyard, the same courtyard where she'd run from a masquerade, where she'd pressed her hand to her sternum and discovered the bond wasn't burning, and she looked at the stone she'd once stood on and felt the distance between that version of herself and this one. Significant distance. Good distance. "He's in the council chamber," Riven said. "He said to bring you directly." The council chamber was warm. He'd told her it was the warmest room in the palace, and he hadn't been wrong. It was the warmth of a room that had fires burning in it consistently through winter, a lived-in warmth, the warmth of actual use rather than ceremony. The long table she'd imagined from his letters was exactly as she'd pictured it. Papers at one end, maps at the other, the particular organized chaos of a space where real decisions happened. He was standing at the window when she came in. He turned. And the room did the heavier thing, the thing Enki had described the first night, except now she knew it was both of them, the bond drawing taut between them like a string pulled to its proper length, resonant rather than tense. She stopped just inside the door. He was across the room. They looked at each other. 2 months of letters, every 4 days, and now the same room, and what she noticed first was not the pull of the bond, not her wolf's immediate warm turn toward him, not even the particular quality of his attention, which was the same as it had always been, full, direct, unperformed. What she noticed first was that he looked like someone who had been holding something carefully for a long time and was deciding whether to set it down. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she said. A pause. "How was the journey?" "Cold. The carriage is very good, though. Much better than the cart." Something moved through his expression, the almost smile she'd learned to recognize from the register of his letters, the one that was there, and then, not there, too controlled to be a full smile, but too present to be nothing. "I'll tell the stable master," he said. She took 2 steps into the room. The bond responded immediately, not dramatically, not urgently, the slow, deep pull of something settling further into alignment. She pressed her attention toward it, which she hadn't done before, which she'd always pressed away from. Warm, even, building, still, but not racing. Not burning. She breathed. "Still warm," she said. She meant it as information, the way he'd given her information in the sitting room 2 months ago. He understood immediately. "Still completing," he said. "More so." They stood in the warm council chamber and looked at each other, and let it be what it was. Significant and frightening, and also exactly right, the specific rightness of something that has been moving toward its position for a long time. "Sit down," he said. "I'll make tea." She almost laughed, at the particular domesticity of it. The Alpha King making tea in his council chamber, which he had told her about in letters, and which was somehow more real and more him than any ceremony or formal bearing she'd observed. "You don't have to. I make my own morning tea," he said. "I can make afternoon tea. It's past the 4th hour. Evening tea, then." He made the tea. She sat at the long table, not at one of the formal positions, but at the end nearest the fire, and she looked at the papers and the maps and the particular texture of the room she'd been imagining for 2 months, and she found it matched. Not exactly. Rooms never matched their imagined versions exactly, but in the ways that mattered. He sat across from her, the same configuration as the archive room, the sitting room, opposite, close enough to share documents, close enough to talk without performance. He pushed a cup toward her. She wrapped her hands around it. "Dav wants to meet you," he said. "He sent me 3 maps this week with margin comments that are increasingly pointed in that direction. I wrote to him about the river fork drainage." "I know." He showed me the note. He described it as a brief pause, the almost smile again. "Confirmation that the correspondence is substantive. Is that a cartographer's approval?" "It's as close as Dav gets to one, yes." She smiled into her tea. They talked for 2 hours, not about the council, not about the formal mating ceremony the advisors wanted. He didn't raise it and she didn't raise it, by mutual unspoken agreement, because it wasn't the conversation for tonight. Tonight was the conversation for the things they'd been saying in letters, and could now say with the actual weight of being in the same room. He told her about the ascension, not the political narrative of it, which she knew from records, but the personal one. 22, and the previous king had died unexpectedly, and there had been a week in which everything he'd understood about his life had been reorganized by forces entirely outside his control, and he'd stood at the window of this room for the first time and thought, "I don't know how to do this." "Did you figure it out?" she asked. "I figured out how to run the kingdom," he said. "That part I got reasonably right, I think. The other parts took longer." He looked at his tea. "The council would say I still haven't figured out the other parts. They might be correct." "You figured out the morning tea," she said. He looked up. She held his gaze with the steadiness she'd been building for months. Not the adequate expression, not the performance. The actual one. "That's not nothing," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "It isn't." She stayed for 5 days. They were not formal days. The council did not convene in her presence. She was not presented or introduced or positioned. She was simply there, in the palace, with a comfortable room in the east wing, and access to the library and the archive room, and, in the evenings, the council chamber. She met Dav on the second day. He was 41, built like someone who spent significant time outdoors, and had the particular quality of a person who had known someone for a long time and evaluated new people primarily on whether they were good for that person. He shook her hand, looked at her with direct assessment, and then said, "The drainage at the river fork has been a problem for 30 years. Nobody from Crestmore has ever mentioned it in correspondence before. It's been a pack council dispute for 4 years," she said. "They can't agree on whose land the fix is on. Tell them it's everyone's problem. Water doesn't respect boundary lines. I'll put that in my next council report," she said seriously, attributed to a cartographer. Something in Dav's expression settled. Not warm. He was not a warm man. She recognized the type. But satisfied. Approved. He sent Caleb a map that evening, with a margin annotation that she didn't see, but which, based on Caleb's expression at dinner, had been positive. She met the palace archivist, who showed her the original ceremony records from the great mating ceremony, with the professional reverence of someone sharing sacred objects, and she found her own entry in the overflow ledger, Voss, S., and looked at it with the specific feeling of a person regarding their own history from sufficient distance to find it interesting. She spent one morning in the archive room, alone, reviewing the historical pack census records from the Western Territories, because she could, and because it was satisfying, and because the archivist had offered, and she had accepted, without making herself small about it. Caleb found her there at midday. "Still reorganizing my records," he said from the doorway. "Your records are very good, actually," she said, without looking up. "The Western Territory census practices are more consistent than most kingdoms manage. Whoever set the standard about 60 years ago knew what they were doing. I'll pass that on to whoever's responsible. It was your grandfather, from the administrative dates." She looked up. He had good instincts for bureaucratic architecture. He looked at her with the expression she'd been watching develop for 3 months. The one that had started as methodical cataloging and had become something else entirely, something that contained the cataloging but had expanded around it to hold other things too. Warmth, recognition, the specific quality of someone who had found the frequency they'd been searching for and kept returning to it to verify it was real. "Sera," he said. Come and have lunch. The archivist will guard the records." She closed the ledger. She went and had lunch. On the 4th evening they walked. Not a planned walk, it was her suggestion, offered because the palace had been feeling enclosed in the particular way enclosed spaces feel when you're on the edge of something significant, and she needed air and motion. He had agreed immediately, which she was coming to understand was characteristic. No performance of deliberation when the answer was simple. Valdenmere in winter evening was lantern-lit and cold, and smelled of wood smoke and river, and the particular quality of city air after a day of human activity. They walked through the quieter streets near the palace, not avoiding the busier areas, just not requiring them, and talked about small things and large things in the interleaved way that had become natural over months of letters. She told him about the frost on the river in the mornings. He told her about the Northern Pack elders who had resolved their border dispute in a way nobody had predicted by simply deciding the disputed land was not worth the relationship cost. "People surprise you," she said. "Sometimes," he said. "I've been king long enough to be cynical about it. Then something like that happens, and I revise." "Keep the revision capacity," she said. "It's good governance." "And good personhood?" "And good personhood," she agreed. They walked in comfortable quiet for a moment. The bond was present. It was always present now. She had stopped trying to calibrate it and had started simply existing alongside it, which was easier and more honest. It moved between them like a warm current, two-directional, steady. She had been thinking about something for 2 days. "The council wants a formal mating ceremony," she said. He glanced at her. "Yes." You said you'd consider it. I said I'd consider it based on what you wanted. She watched the lantern light move on the cobblestones. I want to talk about the oracle's mark, she said, specifically what Oren told me, the conditions. Tell me. She told him, the full version, the way Oren had explained it. The bond triggered in a state of incompleteness. The danger not of the bond itself, but of what the bond does when it ignites without a container. The hearth, the conditions that make the difference between fire that burns and fire that heats. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to value, the specific quality of his listening, which was complete and unhurried. So the question, he said, when she finished, is whether the conditions are met. Yes. And what are the conditions, as you understand them? She looked at the street ahead of them. Full knowledge, she said, on both sides, not surface knowledge, nature, understanding, the things a person would need to know to truly see someone. She paused. I think we have that. I think we've built it. The letters, the conversations, the last 4 days. She paused again. I think you see me. I do, he said, simply. And I see you, she said. Not the king, you. He was quiet. Then the conditions are met, he said. I think so. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. They were standing under a lantern at the corner of a quiet street, and the city moved around them in its winter evening way, and the bond between them was warm and present and still. Not building anymore. She pressed her attention toward it, the way she had been doing for 4 days, checking and rechecking. Still, settled, complete, not burning. She pressed her hand to her sternum, the gesture she hadn't planned in the sitting room 2 months ago, and had never been able to take back. Calum, she said. Yes. I think the hearth is done. He looked at her. In the lantern light, his eyes were the dark amber she had first seen in a palace corridor and had never entirely stopped thinking about. What does that mean for you? He asked. Not assuming, always asking. It means, she said slowly, that I'm not frightened anymore. Not of the bond, not of being seen. She looked at him. And I think I'm ready for whatever comes next. Whatever that looks like. The formal version, the council version, or just, she stopped. Or just this, he said, continuing this. Yes. Those aren't mutually exclusive, he said. We can have both. She looked at him for a moment. If the bond completes, she said, tonight, here, what do you think happens? I think, he said carefully, that the fire finds the hearth. She held very still. He was standing 1 step away from her, in the lantern light, with his hands at his sides, and the particular quality of someone who was holding still, so as not to startle something, but differently than before. Before, he'd held still to give her room. Now it was something else. Now it was the held stillness of someone standing at the edge of something they've been moving toward for a long time, waiting for the right moment. She took the step. His hands came up, not grabbing, not urgent, the careful hands of someone who had been building something and recognized its completion. And when the bond completed, it was exactly what he'd said. Not burning. The warmth expanded, moved through her in slow, even waves, her wolf rising fully for the first time. Not distressed, not struggling, rising the way something rises when it finds the space it was always designed for. She pressed her forehead against his chest and felt his hand in her hair, and the bond between them was a fire in a hearth, complete and contained and warm, and she was alive, completely, fully, unambiguously alive. No burning, not a metaphor, the oracle had said. Also not a sentence. A warning about conditions, and the conditions had been met, and the fire had found its hearth, and she was standing on a winter street in Valdenmere with her forehead against the Alpha King's chest, and she was warm from the inside out, and she was not burning. She started laughing, not politely, not the surprised out of her version, the real kind, genuine and slightly undignified, and entirely beyond management, because 8 years of gray dresses and flat hair and adequate expressions had just resolved in a bond that felt like coming home, and she was standing in the street laughing. He pulled back slightly to look at her. Are you? Not burning, she said. I'm laughing because I'm not burning. I'm sorry. I understand this isn't the most. No, he said. And he smiled. The full version, not the almost, not the controlled one. The actual smile of a man who had spent 12 years being careful and was momentarily not being careful, and it reorganized his face in a way that was, she committed it to memory, precisely, the way she committed census records, because she intended to keep it. No, don't apologize. She pressed her face against his coat and laughed, and he held her in a winter street in Valdenmere, and the bond between them was warm and complete and real. The formal ceremony was 3 weeks later. Not the council's version, or not only the council's version, it was both. The formal political event the advisors had wanted, with the weight of the crown, and the kingdom's attention, and all the appropriate ceremony, and also something else simultaneously, something that was just theirs. She wore green, not the borrowed emerald of the masquerade, her own green, a deep forest color that she had chosen deliberately and without any of the disguise logic that had driven the first choice. Just a color she liked, on her own terms. Her hair was loose. Not because she was hiding behind it, not because the mask required it, because she wanted to wear it loose, and she was allowed to want things, and she had been practicing wanting things for 3 months and had gotten reasonably good at it. Enki attended, having traveled from Duskalo with the energetic delight of someone who had been waiting for this since a corridor conversation outside a lodging room above a bakery. He stood next to Bryn, who was wearing her best dress, and the expression of someone who was very glad about the not burning part. Dav stood on the other side of the room and made 2 margin notes about the hall's architectural proportions before the ceremony began, which Calum noticed and acknowledged with the look of a man who had known Dav for 20 years and found him exactly as exasperating and essential as ever. Riven stood at the front in his second indoor coat and looked efficient and profoundly unmoved by the proceedings, which Sera had come to understand was his version of moved. The ceremony was performed by the kingdom's elder, who used the word sacred 7 times, which Sera counted. She almost smiled when she lost count at 4. When it was done, the words said, the bond formally acknowledged by crown and kingdom, the weight of it settled into something public and real. Calum looked at her with the expression she had learned was his actual face, the one underneath the king, the one she had built the last 3 months learning to see. Still warm, he said, quietly, just to her. Still warm, she said. Good, he said. He took her hand with the precise care of someone who had been building a hearth for months and knew exactly how to tend it. Epilogue. Spring came to Crestmore later than it came to Valdenmere. Sera was there to see it. She split her time now. This had been agreed upon without difficulty, because she had asked, and he had said yes, and they had worked out the details with the same practical directness that characterized everything they did together. 2 weeks in each place, rotating through the months. It was not a perfect system. It had inconveniences and logistics and the occasional missed letter, because letters sent to the wrong location took extra days to redirect. She found she didn't mind. She was writing a letter at the small desk in the back office. The third cabinet from the left reorganized to her satisfaction, the quarterly census rolls complete, the river audible through the open window now that winter had let go, when Enki appeared in the doorway. He had moved to Crestmore. This had happened in stages, a visit that extended, a conversation with Elder Doran about the pack's healing provision, an offer that made sense for everyone, including Enki's long-suffering former supervisor in Dusk Hollow, who had sent a gift basket and a note that read, "The herb cabinets are yours now. Please take good care of them." Enki had wept, briefly, and then reorganized them. He was good at Crestmore. He was good at most places, Sera thought. He had the quality of someone who became quickly indispensable, not through ambition, but through genuine usefulness, and the kind of attention that noticed things before they became problems. He appeared in the doorway now with 2 cups of tea, slightly too bitter, which she had come to believe was simply how he made tea and probably always would be, and the expression of someone with news. "The Oracle's file cabinet," he said. She looked up from the letter. "Third cabinet from the left, under O for Oracle," he said. "I was reorganizing." You reorganized my cabinets? Alphabetically by subject. It's more efficient. He set a cup on her desk. Anyway, I found the file. She looked at him. The original prophecy documentation, he said. Filed 2 years ago by yourself. I thought you might want it. He set a folder on the corner of her desk, next to the letter she was writing. She looked at it. She thought about 16, and the back office with its herbs and wood smoke, and not a metaphor, child. She thought about 8 years of gray dresses. She thought about a masquerade, and a courtyard, and an archive room, and a letter in a drawer, and a winter street in lantern light. She thought about spring coming through the window, and the river, and Enki's slightly too bitter tea. She picked up the folder. She opened it. The prophecy was there in the original archivist's hand, the old oracle's words, recorded precisely. The bond that finds you will be the bond that kills you. The first alpha who truly sees you will trigger a mate bond so powerful it will burn you alive from the inside out. Your wolf cannot hold that much power. It will consume her trying. She read it. She set it down. She picked up her pen and, in the margin of the original document, in her own small, neat hand, added, "Conditions matter. The oracle was right." V. She closed the folder. She filed it back in the third cabinet from the left, under O for oracle. She sat down at her desk and picked up the letter she'd been writing. Calum. Spring is slower here. The river sounds different when the ice melts. I've been listening for it. I found it yesterday, around the 5th hour, a particular note that the winter version doesn't have. Enki reorganized my filing cabinets while I wasn't watching. He found the oracle's file. I read the prophecy again, the original document, in the old handwriting. I made a note in the margin. The Pack Council has finally resolved the River Fork drainage dispute. I'm including the resolution document because the solution they landed on is genuinely creative and I thought Dav might want to annotate it. You can forward it. Bryn says hello. She specifically said, "Tell him he's welcome for next month," which I believe refers to the invitation she extended on your behalf without consulting you at the end of the ceremony. She is not sorry. I'm not sorry either. The fire is warm. Sera, she sealed the letter. She set it on the corner of the desk to go with the morning post. Outside, Crestmore went about its spring morning, the square waking up, the bakery starting its day, the river making its new seasonal sound just out of sight. She looked at the window for a moment. Then she looked at the census rolls, and the quarterly records, and the third cabinet from the left, and the cup of slightly too bitter tea. She smiled. Not the adequate version. The real one. She picked up her pen, and she went back to work. And that's the full story of Sera Voss, the girl who spent 8 years making herself invisible, only to find that the one person she couldn't hide from was the one person worth being seen by. I want to ask you something before you go. When Oren told Sera that the prophecy was a warning about conditions rather than a sentence about outcome, did you see that coming? Or did you believe, like Sera did for most of the story, that the oracle meant it exactly the way it sounded? Because here's what I think is interesting. The oracle was right. She was completely, precisely right. The bond without the right conditions would have burned Sera alive. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say at 16, to a girl who had no frame for it, was that the conditions could be built, that the hearth could be made first. The prophecy was never the enemy. Fear of it was. Drop your answer in the comments. Did you figure out the hearth solution before Enki did? And if you want more stories like this one, with the prophecy twists and the dramatic irony, and the slow burn bonds that actually mean something, you know where to find us. See you in the next story.